Hello everyone. I am Dark Files, and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now, get comfortable and relax. I never considered myself an easily frightened person, not until I found myself alone in a house that didn't feel empty. That summer, I had been entrusted with taking care of my uncle's rural home while he traveled overseas for work. It was a large, creaky farmhouse on the outskirts of a forgotten town, surrounded by dense woods and an eerie silence that settled in after sunset. I had always enjoyed solitude, the kind that let you think, the kind that let you breathe. But this wasn't that kind of solitude. This was the kind that made you feel like something unseen was breathing with you, watching your every move from just beyond the edges of the darkness. The first night was quiet enough. I unpacked, made a cup of tea, and settled into the old leather chair in the living room with a book. The wind howled outside, bending the trees like brittle bones, and every now and then, the old wooden house would groan in response, shifting slightly, as if adjusting itself. I had heard those sounds before, spent enough summers here to know the house had its quirks. But that night, there was something different, a subtle shift in the air, a feeling that made the hairs on my arms rise, despite the warmth of the fire. At some point I must have dozed off, because the next thing I remember is waking up to absolute silence. The kind of silence that felt unnatural, heavy, almost suffocating. The fire had burned low, casting weak orange flickers across the walls. I glanced at the clock on the mantel. 3:17 a.m. Something had woken me, but I wasn't sure what. Then I heard it, a soft creak from the hallway, like the sound of weight shifting against an old floorboard. My breath caught in my throat. The house was supposed to be empty. I sat frozen, listening, straining to hear beyond the pounding of my own heartbeat. The noise didn't come again, but the oppressive stillness that followed was somehow worse. I forced myself to stand, every instinct screaming at me to stay put, to pretend I hadn't heard anything. But the logical part of my brain told me it was nothing. A rodent, maybe, or the house settling again. Still, I grabbed the heavy flashlight from the side table before stepping cautiously toward the hallway. The wooden floor felt ice cold beneath my bare feet as I moved toward the source of the sound. The hallway was long, lined with closed doors on either side, and I suddenly realized how many places there were for something or someone to hide. I clicked on the flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness, illuminating the peeling wallpaper and the framed pictures of relatives long gone. I hesitated before stepping farther, feeling that creeping sensation again, like unseen eyes were locked onto me. Then, from the end of the hall, came a soft tapping sound. Tap, tap, tap. A deliberate rhythm, like knuckles against wood. My grip tightened on the flashlight as I turned toward the noise. At the very end of the hallway, past the last door, was a small window, and in that window, silhouetted against the pale moonlight, was the shadow of a figure. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The figure didn't shift, didn't react, just stood there, its outline just barely human, but somehow wrong. Too tall, too thin. The shape of its head was slightly elongated, and its shoulders sloped at an unnatural angle. I blinked, and it was gone. A sharp breath escaped me, and I stumbled back, gripping the wall for support. I swept the flashlight toward the window, hoping to see nothing, but instead the glass was fogged over, and there, pressed against it, was a single handprint, large, smudged, not mine. A cold dread settled in my stomach as I slowly backed away. The logical part of my mind scrambled for explanations. A trick of the light, my own imagination running wild. But deep down I knew better. Something had been watching me. Something had been inside. The rest of the night, I sat in the living room with every light on, jumping at every creak, every gust of wind. I barely slept, and when the sun finally rose, I convinced myself I had imagined it all. Until I saw the footprints. They started just outside the window where the handprint had been, and trailed around the side of the house, leading toward the woods. Bare footprints too large to be human, with elongated toes that curled slightly into the earth. And they didn't come from the woods, they came from the house. That was the moment I realized I had made a mistake staying here alone. And it was only the first night. The footprints didn't make sense. They circled the house, leading from the window where I had seen the handprint, wrapping around the far side of the building, and disappearing into the tree line. But what unsettled me most was their direction. They didn't start from the forest like some animal had wandered in. They came from the house, from inside. The early morning light cast long shadows across the ground, making the strange impressions stand out against the damp earth. I knelt down, hesitant, tracing the outline of one of the prints with my fingertips. The shape was distorted, longer than a human foot, with a strange curvature to the toes, as if they had curled slightly. When pressing into the dirt, the size was alarming, far too big to belong to me. And there were no signs of shoes. Something had walked barefoot through my uncle's house in the night. A cold unease gripped me, and I found myself glancing over my shoulder at the front door, which now seemed far too open, too vulnerable. I hadn't locked it last night. I had assumed I was alone, but was I? A distant rustling in the trees pulled me from my thoughts. The woods stretched out beyond the property, thick and wild, dense with towering pines and tangled underbrush. I squinted, searching for movement, but saw nothing beyond the shifting shadows of the morning sun. Still, the sensation of being watched hadn't left me. Something was out there. I backed away from the footprints and hurried inside, bolting the door behind me. The lock felt flimsy, inadequate. The whole house, for that matter, suddenly seemed like nothing more than a fragile shell. A structure of old wood and glass, barely separating me from whatever had been lurking inside last night. I checked every room, moving slowly, cautiously. The house had an unnatural stillness to it, the kind that made my skin prickle. I ran my fingers along the walls, the doors, searching for anything out of place, anything that might explain how something had gotten in. That's when I found it. The attic door was ajar. My stomach tightened. The attic was in the hallway, just past the room I had been sleeping in. A pull-down hatch with a wooden ladder that creaked under even the lightest pressure. I knew for a fact I hadn't touched it. I swallowed hard, staring up at the opening. The darkness beyond it yawned, like an open mouth, waiting, breathing. I needed to check. Gripping the edge of the ladder, I hesitated before pulling it down. The old hinges groaned in protest, and dust rained down from the ceiling. I climbed up slowly, peeking my head into the attic's dim interior. The space was cluttered with old furniture, wooden crates, and forgotten relics from my uncle's past. The air was thick with the scent of dust and aged wood, and for a moment, everything seemed undisturbed. Then I saw them. Deep in the dust-covered floor, among years of untouched debris, were footprints, fresh, unmistakable, leading from the attic entrance to the far corner, where a tattered cloth covered something large. Something had been up here. Something had been watching. I swallowed against the tightness in my throat and stepped forward. The wooden floor creaked beneath me, and I fought the overwhelming urge to turn back, to pretend I hadn't seen anything. But I had to know. With a shaking hand, I gripped the edge of the cloth and yanked it away. What I saw underneath made my blood run cold. It was a nest, a twisted makeshift bed of torn fabric, shredded insulation, and worst of all, bones, small ones, animal-like, scattered across the mess like remnants of past meals. The scent of decay clung to the air, faint but unmistakable. Something had been living in this attic. I backed away, my pulse hammering in my ears. My foot caught the edge of a loose board, sending it clattering to the floor. The sound was deafening in the silence. And then, from somewhere below me in the house, came a noise, a slow, deliberate creak. Someone, or something, was moving downstairs. I froze, every muscle in my body tensing. The sound was unmistakable. A floorboard near the living room. Slow, unhurried steps. I wasn't alone. The realization struck like ice down my spine. Whatever had left those footprints, whatever had pressed its hand against my window, had never left. It had been here the whole time. I moved carefully, trying not to make a sound as I backed toward the attic entrance. My mind raced. I had no weapon, No way to defend myself. My phone was downstairs. My only option was to get out. Another creak. Closer this time. My heart pounded as I reached the attic ladder. Gripping it tightly, I didn't want to go down. Whatever was in the house was between me and the only exit. But I had no choice. Slowly, painstakingly, I climbed down, keeping my breathing shallow, my movements light. As I reached the bottom, the house fell silent again. I waited. Nothing. The living room was just around the corner. I couldn't see beyond the doorway, couldn't tell if something was waiting in the shadows. I clenched my fists, stepping carefully across the wooden floor. And then I saw it. Just beyond the doorway, half hidden in the dim light of the morning, was a shape, tall, thin, wrong. Its head was turned slightly, as if listening. Its arms hung too long at its sides, fingers twitching. Its skin was the color of ash, stretched tight over an emaciated frame, and its eyes, dark, hollow, endless, were locked directly on me. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then, in a motion too fast, too unnatural, it tilted its head, and the corners of its mouth twitched upward, into something that wasn't a smile, something that wasn't human. I ran. I didn't think. I didn't plan. I just ran. The moment my body moved, the thing in the doorway reacted, a sharp jerking motion, like a puppet whose strings had just been yanked. I heard the scrape of its feet against the wooden floor, the unnatural speed of its movements. As it gave chase, I sprinted down the hallway, past the attic entrance, past the locked doors of empty rooms. The house had never felt so long, the exit so impossibly far away. My breath came in ragged gasps, my heart beat a deafening drum in my ears. Then behind me, too close, a sound, a rasping exhale, wet, shallow. I didn't dare look. I reached the staircase, my foot catching the edge of the first step. I stumbled but didn't fall, throwing myself forward as I half ran, half tumbled down. The walls blurred past me. My only thought was the door, the lock, the outside. A deep guttural sound rose behind me, something between a growl and a low, distorted chuckle. I hit the bottom step and lunged for the front door. My fingers fumbled with the lock, my pulse hammering. It felt stiff, resistant, as if it hadn't been used in years. I wrenched at it, panic flooding through me. Then, from the top of the stairs, a single thud. I knew without turning that it had reached the landing. The lock finally gave way. I yanked the door open, the cold morning air slamming into me like a wave of relief. Without hesitation, I threw myself outside, nearly tripping over my own feet. As I stumbled onto the gravel driveway, I didn't stop, not even when I heard the sound of something shifting behind me. A slow, dragging step just inside the threshold. I ran until my lungs burned, until the house was just a distant shape behind me, swallowed by the mist rising from the trees. I didn't stop until I reached town. The locals were hesitant to believe me. The sheriff, a grizzled man in his 60s, listened with furrowed brows and a doubtful frown. "You sure you didn't dream it, son?" he asked. I showed him the footprints, the ones outside the house, the ones that didn't belong to me. His expression changed. He didn't ask any more questions after that. Instead, he called for backup. By the time we returned to my uncle's house, the atmosphere had shifted. The sun was higher now, casting long shadows across the property. But the air still felt wrong, heavy, like the house itself was holding its breath. 2 deputies joined us, their hands hovering near their holsters as they approached the front door. It was still open. The sheriff gestured for me to stay back as he and the others stepped inside. I hesitated, torn between relief and dread. I wanted them to see what I had seen, to confirm that I hadn't imagined it. But a deeper, quieter part of me feared what they might find. Minutes passed, then more. The house remained eerily silent, then movement. The sheriff reappeared in the doorway, his expression unreadable. "Come take a look," he said. I swallowed hard and followed. The house was untouched. The attic door was shut, the footprints in the dust, gone. No signs of a struggle, no lingering presence, no creature, nothing. It was as if I had imagined everything, but I knew better, and so did the sheriff. He didn't say much after that, but there was something in his eyes, something cautious. He asked me where I was staying, told me it might be best if I found somewhere else for the night. I didn't argue. That night, I lay awake in a motel room on the outskirts of town, staring at the ceiling. The sound of passing cars outside felt oddly comforting, but sleep didn't come easy, because I knew, deep in my gut, in the marrow of my bones, that it wasn't over. Whatever had been in that house, it wasn't finished with me, and somehow, some way, it would find me again. I left my uncle's house behind, but the feeling never left me. That heavy, suffocating weight, like something unseen, still lingered just beyond my vision. I should have felt safe in the motel, surrounded by normalcy, the hum of the vending machine down the hall, the distant murmur of a television from the next room, but it was a false sense of security, a thin veil, because deep down I knew it wasn't over. I didn't tell my uncle what had happened when I called him the next morning. What was I supposed to say? Hey, I think something inhuman was living in your attic. No, I told him there was an issue with the locks, that I felt uncomfortable staying alone in the house, and that I booked a motel for the remainder of my time in town. He didn't question it, but the sheriff did. I saw Sin again that afternoon, outside a small diner near the motel. He wasn't in uniform, just an old button-up and worn jeans, but something about him still carried an air of authority. Mind if I sit? He asked, gesturing to the empty seat across from me. I nodded. He settled in, folding his hands on the table, his fingers tapping idly against the faded surface. For a long moment, he just studied me. Then finally, "You're not the first." I frowned. The first what? The first to see something in that house. The words sent an immediate chill through me. He exhaled slowly, glancing toward the window before continuing. "Your uncle's place. It has a history. Goes back decades. I can't say for sure what's been seen in that house, but I can tell you one thing. People don't stay there long. Not alone anyway." I swallowed. "Why?" He hesitated. Then, in a quiet voice, he said, "Because sometimes they don't leave at all." The air between us felt suddenly heavier, like the weight of his words had settled into the space around us. "There was a man who lived there before your uncle," the sheriff continued, "back in the 70s. Name was Howard Lane. Moved in after his wife passed. Folks in town didn't see much of him, but when they did, he looked tired, haunted." He leaned in slightly. "One day, he just vanished, left everything behind. His truck, his clothes, even his shoes. No sign of struggle, no forced entry, just gone." I shivered, and they never found him. The sheriff shook his head. "Not a trace." The waitress refilled our coffee cups, and for a brief moment, the world felt normal again. Sunlight streamed through the window. The scent of fresh coffee filled the air, but the sheriff's words clung to me like damp air. He took a sip from his cup before speaking again. "There's something else." I tensed. "When we searched your uncle's house yesterday, we did find something." My pulse quickened. "What?" He reached into his jacket and pulled out a small plastic evidence bag. Inside was a torn scrap of fabric. It was old, discolored, like it had been sitting in the attic for years. But that wasn't what made my stomach drop. It was the dried, dark stain on it. Blood. The sheriff placed the bag on the table. "This was wedged between the attic floorboards. We don't know how long it's been there, but..." He let the implication hang in the air. I forced myself to breathe. "Are you saying that thing I saw?" "I'm saying," he cut in, "that something isn't right about that house, and I think you know that better than anyone." That night, I locked every door, every window. I left the lights on, my phone within reach. I told myself I was safe, that the motel wasn't the house, that whatever had been there couldn't reach me here. But at 3:17 a.m., I woke up to silence, the kind of silence that was too deep, too unnatural. And then, a slow, deliberate tap from the motel window. I didn't move, didn't breathe. Another tap, then a long, slow exhale, and a whisper, low and rasping, just beyond the glass. "I found you." I didn't turn toward the window. I couldn't. Every muscle in my body was locked in place, my breathing shallow, my pulse hammering so loudly, I swore it would give me away. The whisper had been right against the glass. I found you. The motel room suddenly felt suffocating. The walls pressing in, the air thick with something unseen. I squeezed my eyes shut, willing myself to wake up, to shake off this nightmare. But then, another tap, a slow, deliberate sound, like a fingernail against the glass. Then the whisper came again, closer this time. Open the door. A cold rush of terror surged through me. No, I wouldn't. I forced myself to move, inching my hand toward my phone on the nightstand. If I could just call someone, the sheriff, anyone. Another tap. And then, the doorknob rattled. Not violently, not with force, just a slow testing motion, like something was waiting. I grabbed my phone, my fingers trembling as I swiped at the screen. I managed to pull up the sheriff's number, hit call, ring, the doorknob stilled, ring, silence, ring, then, the call connected. Sheriff, I whispered, my voice barely audible. It's here. A pause, then his voice, steady, but tense. Where? I swallowed. Outside my door. My window. I don't know how it found me, but, the whisper came again. Let me in. Terror jolted through me. I squeezed my eyes shut, gripping the phone so tightly. My knuckles ached. Then, the sheriff's voice came through, calm but firm. Don't open the door. Don't look outside. Stay where you are. I'm on my way. I barely managed to nod, though he couldn't see me. Hurry. Then the line cut, and in the silence that followed, the whisper turned into something else. A low, guttural laugh, a slow scraping sound against the door, and then the knocking began. The knocking wasn't loud. It wasn't frantic. It was soft, deliberate, a steady rhythm, each knock spaced evenly apart, like it had all the time in the world. I pressed my back against the headboard, gripping my phone like a lifeline. The minutes stretched endlessly, every second heavier than the last. I thought about running, about bolting out of the room, and sprinting down the motel hallway. But the thought of stepping into the open, of exposing myself, was worse. The knocking stopped. Silence. Then the sound of something brushing against the bottom of the door. A whisper, this time quieter, almost thoughtful. You're afraid. My breath hitched. Another scrape against the wood. You should be. I clenched my jaw, forcing myself to stay still, to stay quiet. But my hands were shaking. My whole body was. Then footsteps. Not walking away. Pacing. Slow, measured steps just beyond the door. Back and forth. Waiting. The minutes crawled by. The pacing continued. The sheriff would be here soon. I told myself, just hold on. Then suddenly, the pacing stopped. I strained to listen. Nothing. Then the door handle turned. Not rattling this time. Not testing. Turning. The lock held, but the pressure against it was steady, insistent. Then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. A long silence. Then, a whisper so close, I swore I felt the breath through the door. See you soon. And then, footsteps. Slow. Retreating. Fading. Gone. I didn't move. Didn't breathe. And then, finally, red and blue lights flashed through the curtains. The sheriff had arrived. I didn't open the door until I heard the sheriff's voice. You in there? I scrambled to my feet, unlocking the door so fast, my fingers fumbled against the latch. The moment it swung open, I felt like I could breathe again. The sheriff stood just beyond the threshold, one hand on his holster, scanning the empty parking lot behind him. You all right? He asked. I nodded, though I wasn't sure if it was true. He stepped inside, shutting the door behind him. Tell me exactly what happened. I did. Every detail. The knocking, the whispers, the way it had tried the door, the way it had known I was afraid, the way it had promised to return. The sheriff listened in silence, his expression unreadable. When I finished, he exhaled slowly, rubbing a hand over his jaw. Whatever this is, he said finally, it's not just tied to that house. A sick realization settled over me. It followed me. He nodded grimly. And I don't think it's done. I swallowed hard. So what do I do? The sheriff didn't answer right away. He glanced toward the window, his jaw tightening. "You're not safe here." I shivered. "Where am I safe?" A long pause. Finally, he looked at me, his expression unreadable. "We need to go back." I stared at him. "Back where?" His gaze was steady. "The house." A cold dread wrapped around me. "No," I said immediately. "No way. I barely got out of there." "I know," he sighed. "But whatever this is, it's connected to that place. We need to figure out why." I shook my head. "I'm not going back in there." His voice softened. "I wouldn't ask you to, but I have to go, and I need to know everything you saw." I hesitated. Every instinct told me to run, to get as far away as possible. But I also knew, deep down, if I didn't face this, it wouldn't stop. It would find me, again and again. I took a shaky breath. "Fine," I said. "Let's go." The sheriff nodded, and together we left the motel, headed back to the one place I swore I would never return to. The drive back to my uncle's house was silent. The sheriff kept his eyes on the road, his fingers drumming idly against the steering wheel. I stared out the window, watching as the town faded behind us, replaced by open fields and dense woodland. A pit had settled in my stomach. I hadn't wanted to come back. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to get as far away from that place as possible. But I also knew I couldn't escape it. Not until I understood what it was. Not until I knew why it had chosen me. The sheriff finally broke the silence. "You said it whispered to you," he murmured. "Told you it found you." I nodded, my throat tight. That's not the first time I've heard something like that. I turned to him. "What do you mean?" His grip tightened on the wheel. "Years ago there was another man who stayed at that house. A drifter. Didn't live there, just passed through. Town folks didn't think much of it, until he started talking about something following him." A chill ran down my spine. "What happened to him?" The sheriff's expression darkened. "He disappeared, just like the others." I swallowed hard. "And no one ever found him." He shook his head. A heavy silence settled over us again. Then, just ahead, the house came into view, and the moment I saw it, my breath caught in my throat. The front door was open. The sheriff slowed the car, his jaw tightening. "Stay close," he murmured. As we stepped out, the air felt heavier here, charged, like the very ground beneath us was holding its breath. We approached the front porch cautiously, the wooden steps groaning under our weight. The door swayed slightly in the wind, revealing glimpses of the darkened interior beyond. The sheriff glanced at me. "You sure it was locked when you left?" I nodded, my pulse quickening. "I'm sure." We stepped inside. The house was silent, unnaturally so. Dust motes floated in the dim light, swirling lazily through the air. Everything looked untouched, exactly as I had left it. But something felt different, wrong. The sheriff moved ahead of me, his boots scuffing against the old wooden floor. "Stay behind me," he murmured. We made our way toward the living room. The air was thick with dust, and something else, something faint, but unmistakable, decay. The sheriff stiffened. I followed his gaze, and felt my stomach drop. In the center of the room, carved deep into the wooden floor, was a symbol, a crude, circular marking, etched with jagged lines and strange twisting shapes. The wood around it was blackened, as if burned. "What the hell is this?" I whispered. The sheriff didn't answer. He crouched beside the symbol, running a finger along its charred edges. His expression was grim. "I've seen this before." A cold dread crept over me.
"What?"
He exhaled slowly. "The last place someone went missing." I stared at him. "You think this has something to do with that?" "I don't think." His voice was quiet, but firm. "I know." The house suddenly felt even smaller, the walls pressing in, the silence too deep. Then, from somewhere upstairs, a slow, deliberate creak. My breath hitched. We weren't alone. The sheriff rose to his feet, his hand hovering over his holster. "Stay close." I nodded, my pulse hammering. We moved toward the staircase, each step measured, cautious. The air grew colder, the sense of wrongness thickening. Another creak, then a whisper, soft, almost playful. "Still afraid?" A chill shot down my spine. The voice was familiar. It was the same voice from the motel. The sheriff froze. "You heard that?" I nodded. Then, from the top of the stairs, a shadow moved. Not fast, not jerky, slow, deliberate, like it wanted us to see, like it was waiting. A shape emerged from the darkness, tall, thin, wrong, its head tilted at an unnatural angle, its hollow eyes locked onto mine. I couldn't breathe. Then, a slow curling smile. The sheriff reached for his gun, and the lights went out. The house plunged into darkness. For a moment, there was nothing but silence, the deep, suffocating kind that makes your ears strain for any hint of movement. My breath was caught in my throat, my muscles locked in place. Then, footsteps, slow, measured, coming down the stairs. The sheriff moved first, yanking a flashlight from his belt and flicking it on. The beam cut through the darkness, landing on the staircase. Empty, no figure, no movement. But the footsteps hadn't stopped. They were closer. I took a shaky step back, my body screaming to run. The sheriff swept the flashlight around the room, the beam shaking slightly as it passed over the walls, the ceiling, the doorway. Then from just behind me, a breath, cold, damp, right against my neck. I turned too fast, stumbling backward, my foot catching the edge of the rug. I went down hard, knocking over a chair in the process. The sheriff's flashlight whipped toward me, and that's when we saw it. No longer on the stairs, no longer waiting. It was right there, in the center of the room, tall, thin, twisted, its head tilting, lips curling in that same sick, knowing grin. And then, it spoke. Run. The sheriff fired. The gunshot split the silence like a crack of thunder, the sound deafening in the enclosed space. The figure didn't flinch, didn't move. Then, just as the bullet should have hit, it flickered, like static, like it wasn't really there at all. My stomach twisted with cold, primal fear. The sheriff didn't fire again. His hands were steady, his breath controlled, but I could see the tension in his jaw. He knew, this thing wasn't something a bullet could stop. The figure took a step forward, and suddenly, the whole house seemed to breathe with it. The walls groaned, the floor shuddered beneath us, the air thickened, heavy with something unseen, something vast and watching. I scrambled to my feet. We have to get out of here. The sheriff nodded, stepping back toward the door. Move, now. The thing didn't try to stop us. It just stood there, smiling, watching. We didn't look back as we ran. The cold night air hit me like a shock. But I didn't stop running. Not until we reached the sheriff's car. He yanked the door open, ushering me inside before slamming the driver's side shut. His hands were tight on the wheel, knuckles white as he turned the key. The engine roared to life. Headlights flooded the front of the house, illuminating the porch, the open doorway. Nothing, no figure, no movement, but the sense of wrongness still lingered. A weight pressing down on my chest, an unseen presence that refused to leave. The sheriff didn't waste time. He threw the car into reverse, spinning us around on the dirt path, the tires kicking up dust as we sped away. Neither of us spoke for a long time. The town came into view far too slowly, the distant glow of streetlights barely penetrating the heavy darkness that clung to everything. Finally, I found my voice. What the hell was that? The sheriff exhaled sharply. I don't know. I turned to him, my pulse still hammering. You've seen things like that before. He hesitated. Then, finally, I've heard stories. I swallowed hard. And, he glanced at me, his expression unreadable. They don't end well. A fresh wave of dread settled over me. So what do we do now? The sheriff didn't answer right away. His eyes stayed locked on the road ahead, his jaw tense. Then, in a quiet voice, he said, we find out what it wants. I didn't want to sleep, not after everything that had happened, but exhaustion pulled at me like a weight, my body aching from tension, my mind sluggish with fear. The sheriff had taken me back to the station, given me an old cot in the back room. Stay here, he had said, at least until we figure this out. I didn't argue, but sleep didn't come easy. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that thing in the house, the way it had moved, the way it had spoken. Run, like it had been toying with me, like it had been waiting for something. Somewhere around 4 a.m., I must have drifted off, because the next thing I remember was the whisper right against my ear. Wake up. I shot upright, my heart nearly stopping. The room was dark, the station silent, but something felt different. Wrong. I fumbled for the small desk lamp. Flipping it on, the weak yellow glow filled the space, revealing nothing out of place. But I wasn't alone. I could feel it, a presence, watching. My breath came in shallow gasps as I turned toward the door and stopped. The floor. There were footprints, dark, wet, leading from the entrance to the side of my cot. I didn't move, didn't breathe. Then, a slow, deliberate creak from just outside the room. Something was waiting. I reached for my phone with trembling fingers, texting the sheriff 2 words. It's here. The read receipt popped up instantly. And then, the station lights flickered, and the door handle turned. The door handle turned slowly. A quiet, deliberate motion. I pressed myself against the back of the cot, my pulse hammering. The station was supposed to be safe, but I knew deep in my bones that there was no such thing as safe anymore. The lights flickered again, a slow, rhythmic pulse casting shifting shadows across the walls. The door creaked open an inch, then another. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. And then, footsteps, soft, bare, moving across the wooden floor of the station hallway. I swallowed down a whimper, my fingers clutching the edge of the cot. My phone sat useless in my lap, the message to the sheriff still open, the read receipt staring back at me. Why wasn't he here? The footsteps stopped just outside my room. A silence stretched, thick and heavy, pressing down on my chest. Then, the whisper, "You can't run forever." I nearly choked on my own breath, my vision blurred with terror, as I forced my body to move, scrambling off the cot and pressing myself against the farthest wall. The door slowly swung open. The figure stood there, not quite in the light, not quite in the dark, close enough for me to see its shape. Too tall, too thin, too wrong. Its head tilted slightly, lips curling in a mockery of amusement. It was enjoying this, a sick game. I reached for my phone again, my fingers trembling so hard, I almost dropped it. My vision blurred as I hit the sheriff's contact, pressing the call button over and over. Ring, ring. The thing in the doorway took a step forward. Ring, another step. I could see its face now, hollow eyes, stretched too tight skin. Ring. The air shifted cold and stale. Then, a voice, not from the creature, from the doorway behind it. Step away from him. The sheriff. His gun was raised, his expression unreadable. The figure stilled. For a long stretched moment, no one moved. Then, in a slow twisting motion, the thing turned toward the sheriff. Its grin widened. Too late. It whispered, and the lights went out. Darkness swallowed everything. I heard movement, fast, jerking, unnatural, a scraping sound against the walls. Then, a gunshot. The muzzle flash lit up the room for less than a second. But it was enough. Enough for me to see the figure lunging. Enough for me to see the sheriff stumbling back. Then, silence. I pressed myself against the wall, blind in the dark, my ears straining for any sound. A breath, raspy, shallow, but I couldn't tell who it belonged to. "Sheriff," I whispered. Silence. Then, another gunshot. A snarl tore through the air, low and guttural, followed by the sound of something heavy hitting the ground. The sheriff's voice cut through the dark. "Move now." I didn't hesitate. I stumbled forward, feeling blindly for the doorframe, my hands shaking. The sheriff grabbed my wrist, yanking me forward. We ran, down the hallway, out of the station, into the freezing night air. I didn't look back. The sheriff's car was parked at the curb, engine still running. We barely made it inside before he threw it into drive, tires screeching as we sped away. My chest heaved, my pulse thundering. What was that thing? I gasped. The sheriff didn't answer right away. His hands were gripping the wheel, his eyes locked on the road. When he finally spoke, his voice was low. "I don't know." I swallowed. "But you've seen it before." A pause. Then, "Not like that." I shuddered. The town blurred past us, streetlights flickering through the windows. Then, A sound, a whisper, from the back seat. I turned, my stomach twisting. Nothing. But I knew it wasn't gone. The sheriff must have felt it too, because he didn't stop driving, didn't slow down, didn't look back, not even once. We left town that night, drove until the sun rose, until the empty highways stretched endlessly before us. Neither of us spoke. There was nothing to say, because we both knew this wasn't over. It would never be over. No matter where I went, no matter how far I ran, it would find me. It always did. And next time, I might not escape. I always hated staying home alone, not because I was afraid of the dark, or because I thought someone might break in. No, it was something else. A feeling, an unease that settled deep in my chest whenever the house was empty. Like something else was here, watching, waiting. My parents were gone for the weekend, off to visit my aunt in another state. I told them I'd be fine. I was an adult now. Staying home alone wasn't supposed to scare me. But as the sun dipped below the horizon, and the house fell into silence, that feeling crept in. The weight of it pressed against my shoulders. As I locked the doors, checked the windows, I told myself it was just my imagination, that the creaks and groans of the old house were nothing more than wood settling, pipes shifting. But deep down I knew better. I had always known. The first night passed in uneasy quiet. I kept the lights on, the TV humming in the background to fill the empty space. I scrolled mindlessly through my phone, trying to ignore the way the house felt too still, too expectant. By 2 a.m., exhaustion finally pulled me under. I left the living room light on as I made my way to bed, telling myself that nothing was wrong, nothing was watching, nothing was waiting. I slept fitfully, drifting in and out of strange half-formed dreams. Then, somewhere in the middle of the night, a noise, soft, barely there, a creak, like footsteps. My eyes shot open, my pulse hammering in my ears. The house was quiet, too quiet. I held my breath, straining to listen. Nothing. Had I imagined it? I turned onto my side, exhaling slowly, just the house settling, just my nerves. Then, another creak, closer this time. My blood ran cold. The floorboards outside my room only made that sound when someone stepped on them. I squeezed my eyes shut, every muscle locking in place. Then, a whisper, right outside my door. "Are you awake?" I stopped breathing. The whisper had been right outside my bedroom door, soft, careful, almost curious. I stayed frozen, my body rigid beneath the blankets, my mind racing. I hadn't imagined it. I couldn't have. Someone was out there. Someone was in my house. I swallowed hard, my throat dry, my pulse hammering so loudly. I swore it would give me away. Silence. Had I misheard it? Had my exhausted brain twisted the creaks and groans of the old house into something worse? I waited. Seconds stretched into an eternity. Then, a slow, deliberate knock. Just once. Then another. Knock. Knock. My breath hitched. My fingers dug into the sheets. I couldn't move. Didn't dare make a sound. Knock. Knock. Then, silence. I waited, my ears straining for any hint of movement. But nothing came. Minutes passed. Then more. Finally, after what felt like an hour, I dared to move. Slowly, carefully, I reached for my phone on the nightstand. My fingers trembled as I lit up the screen. 3:17 a.m. I hesitated. Then, moving as silently as I could, I shifted out of bed, pressing my ear against the door. Nothing. I swallowed down the lump in my throat. My fingers hovered over the doorknob, every instinct screaming at me not to open it. But I had to check. I had to know. With one final deep breath, I turned the knob. The door creaked open. The hallway was empty. But something was wrong. The air was heavy, thick with something unseen. The dim light from the bathroom nightlight barely reached the end of the hall. Shadows pooled in the corners, stretching unnaturally across the floor. I stepped forward, my bare feet barely making a sound against the wood. The house was dead silent, but I knew, deep down, I wasn't alone. And then I saw it, the closet door at the end of the hall. It was open, just a crack, just wide enough for someone to be standing behind it, watching. waiting. I took a slow step back, then another, and then the door moved. A fraction of an inch. My stomach twisted. My breath caught in my throat. Something was in there, and it knew I was watching. I didn't move, didn't breathe. The closet door stood slightly open at the end of the hall, just enough for a sliver of darkness to peek through. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, that maybe I had left it open, that maybe the air from the vents had shifted it. But deep down I knew better. Something was in there, and it was watching me. I took another step back, my pulse hammering. The silence in the house was suffocating now, pressing in from all sides. I had to do something, call someone, run, get out, but I couldn't make my body move. Then the closet door shifted again. Not a gust of air, not the house settling. It was deliberate, a slow, careful movement. I turned and bolted. I didn't look back. I didn't hesitate. I ran straight for my room, slamming the door shut and locking it in one desperate motion. Then I pressed my back against the wall, my breath coming in ragged gasps. Silence. Then soft, deliberate footsteps, moving down the hall, toward my door. I squeezed my eyes shut, pressing my hand over my mouth to keep from making a sound. The footsteps stopped, right outside. I could hear my own heartbeat, pounding in my ears. Then, a whisper, so close I swore. I felt it through the wood. Let me in. I clenched my jaw, forcing myself to stay silent. The whisper had been right against my door. Low, patient. I gripped my phone, my fingers trembling as I dialed. 911. Ring, ring. The whisper came again. Why are you hiding? My stomach twisted. Ring, ring. A soft tap, tap, tap. Against the wood, my whole body locked up. Then, finally, the call connected. 911. What's your emergency? I sucked in a breath, barely able to form words. As someone's in my house. The tapping stopped. For a second, I thought the call had cut out. Then, a rustling sound from under the door, like fingertips brushing against the carpet. Can you confirm your address? The operator asked. I barely managed to whisper it, my voice trembling. Stay on the line. Officers are on their way. I nodded, even though they couldn't see me. Silence stretched on. The presence outside my door didn't move. Then, slowly, deliberately, the doorknob twisted. The lock held, but the pressure against it was steady. Testing. I pressed my back harder against the wall, clutching my phone like a lifeline. The police are coming, I whispered, barely able to get the words out. Silence. Then, a quiet, amused chuckle, like it knew something I didn't. I squeezed my eyes shut. Please hurry. I whispered into the phone. They're on their way, the operator assured me. The doorknob twisted again, harder this time. Then, the lights flickered. My breath caught in my throat. It was still outside, but something felt different, wrong. The air grew heavy, thick, and then, a low voice, not whispering this time. You shouldn't have called them. The line went dead. I stared at the screen in horror. No service. The room felt colder now. The air thick with something unseen, something pressing down on me. Then, a slow, deliberate knock against the door. 1, 2, 3. It wasn't rushed. It wasn't violent. Just waiting. I could barely breathe. Then, a deep, slow inhale from the other side of the door, like it was smelling me. I clenched my fists, forcing myself not to make a sound. The silence stretched on. Then, footsteps. Slow, measured, moving away from my door. I didn't move, didn't exhale. I just listened. The steps faded down the hall. Then, the sound of the front door creaking open and closing. I didn't dare move. Not for a long time. Not until I heard the distant wail of sirens. Only then did I unlock the door. Only then did I dare to step outside. The house was empty. The front door was still locked. There were no signs of a break-in, no footprints, no forced entry, nothing. But I knew something had been here. The police arrived minutes later. 2 officers stepped inside, their hands hovering over their holsters. They searched the house, checking every room, every closet. Nothing. No intruder. No sign that anyone had ever been here at all. I tried to explain. The whispers, the knocking, the thing outside my door. The officers exchanged a look. Then one of them said something that made my stomach drop. The call never went through. I stared at him. What? He showed me his radio. We never got a call from this address. We were just doing a routine patrol when we saw the lights flickering from the road. My hands turned ice cold. I had been talking to someone, hadn't I? The officer gave me a long look. Maybe you were dreaming. I wanted to argue, but then I saw it. The closet door at the end of the hall, still cracked open, still exactly where I had seen it before, and deep in the darkness behind it, something moved. The closet door didn't creak, didn't shift suddenly, but something inside moved. A subtle, almost imperceptible motion, like breathing. The officers didn't notice at first. They were too busy checking the rest of the house, muttering something about paranoia, about how people got jumpy when they were alone too long. But I saw it, and when I took a slow, shaky step backward, it saw me too. A shape deep in the shadows, just barely visible, too tall, too still. I forced my voice out. There, in the closet, the officers turned, one of them stepping forward, hand resting on his holster. It's just an old storage. Then he stopped. I saw it happen, the exact second he realized something was in there, because his whole body tensed. The air in the house shifted. He reached for the closet door, pulled it open, and for one brief, horrible second, I saw what was inside. Too many limbs, too many joints bending the wrong way, a mouth that didn't belong. And then the lights went out. Everything plunged into darkness. The officers shouted. One of them yanked a flashlight from his belt, the beam slicing through the black. For half a second, I saw it lunging, a blur of limbs, a snapping, distorted grin. Then chaos. The officer fired, a deafening crack of gunfire, the flash illuminating the room. But there was nothing there. The closet was empty. No blood, no body, no sign that anything had ever been inside. But the air, it was wrong, heavy, dense, like something unseen was still in the room, watching, waiting. The other officer grabbed my arm. We need to go. Now. I didn't argue. We ran. The front door slammed behind us. The air outside felt thin, normal, but something told me it wasn't over, not even close. We stood outside, the cold air biting against my skin, but I barely felt it. The officers exchanged a glance. Neither of them spoke, because they knew, even if they didn't want to admit it, something had been in that house. And now, it was gone. The first officer holstered his gun, his movements stiff. "We'll file a report," he muttered, more to himself than to me. The second officer was still gripping my arm. His hand was cold. I pulled away, hugging myself. What happens now? They didn't answer right away. Then, stay somewhere else tonight. I swallowed. And after that, the officer shook his head. We don't know. I exhaled shakily. I didn't want to go back inside. Didn't want to step foot in that house again. But as I stared at the darkened windows, the gaping front door, I realized something. It wasn't done with me. It would follow, wherever I went, however far I ran. And I had no idea when it would come back. I didn't sleep that night. The officers left after checking the house one last time. They told me to call, if anything else happened. But I knew deep in my gut, that calling wouldn't help. Not anymore. I sat in my car outside the house, staring at it. The windows were dark, empty. The front door was locked. Everything looked normal. But it wasn't. I couldn't stay here. I didn't want to. So I drove. I didn't know where I was going. Just away. The road stretched endlessly ahead of me, swallowed by the night. My headlights carved a narrow path through the dark, illuminating nothing but trees and pavement. I should have felt safer. I didn't, because no matter how far I drove, that feeling didn't leave me, like something was still watching, still waiting. I stopped at a gas station an hour outside of town. The place was empty, the neon lights buzzing faintly against the silence. I filled my tank, keeping my eyes on the road behind me. Nothing, no movement, no signs that I had been followed, but the feeling was still there. I went inside, grabbing a coffee just to have something warm in my hands. The clerk, an old man with tired eyes, barely glanced at me as I paid. Then, "You look like you've seen a ghost." I forced a weak chuckle. "Something like that." He just nodded. "Careful driving this late." I hesitated. "Why?" He shrugged. "Strange things happen at night." I shivered. "Like what?" He didn't answer right away. Then in a quiet voice, "Like things following people who don't know they've already been claimed." A chill ran down my spine. "What?" But the clerk just shook his head. "Have a safe trip." I got back in my car, my hands shaking slightly. As I gripped the wheel, I needed to keep moving. I needed to get as far away as possible. The gas station disappeared behind me, swallowed by the dark. The road stretched on, empty and endless. For the first time in hours, I allowed myself to breathe. Maybe I had outrun it. Maybe. Then, a whisper from the back seat. "Keep driving." I froze, my hands locked on the wheel, my breath caught in my throat. I didn't turn around. I didn't dare. The air in the car shifted, heavier, colder. The whisper came again, low, amused. "You didn't think it would be that easy, did you?" The car swerved as my body reacted on instinct, my breath hitching in panic. I gripped the wheel, trying to steady myself. The whisper wasn't my imagination. It was here. I could feel it, sitting in the darkness behind me, watching, waiting. My stomach twisted, my throat burned with fear. I forced myself to keep driving, my knuckles white on the wheel. "What do you want?" I whispered. Silence. Then, a low, breathy chuckle. "You'll see." I shuddered. The road ahead stretched into nothingness, and I realized, no matter where I went, no matter how far I ran, I was never alone. The sun rose, painting the sky in dull grays and pale blues. I hadn't stopped driving, not once, but I knew it didn't matter. I could feel it, still with me, still waiting. I finally pulled over at a rest stop, gripping the wheel so hard my hands ached. My body screamed for sleep, but I knew the moment I closed my eyes, it would come. I stepped out of the car, breathing in the cold morning air. The highway stretched on, empty and endless. For a brief second, I felt normal, like maybe I had escaped. Like maybe. Then, in the reflection of my car window, a shape, tall, thin, smiling, standing right behind me. I turned. Nothing. The whisper came one last time, soft, certain. "You belong to me now." And deep down I knew it was right. The job seemed too good to be true. A house-sitting gig, no rent, no bills, just stay in a remote cabin for 2 weeks while the owner was away. The pay was generous, almost suspiciously so, but at the time, I didn't care. I needed the money, and I needed to get away. The cabin sat deep in the woods, miles from the nearest town. The owner, a quiet older man named Mr. Harrison, barely gave me any instructions before leaving. Just one rule: at night, keep the doors locked, and whatever you do, don't look outside. That was it. No explanation, no reason why. I thought it was a joke at first. It wasn't. The first night was uneventful. I made myself dinner, checked my phone. No service, of course. Then settled onto the couch with an old book I'd found on the shelf. The house creaked and groaned like old buildings do, but I didn't think much of it until I heard it. A soft sound, somewhere outside. At first, I thought it was the wind, but then, a tap against the window. I froze. The curtains were drawn, blocking the view. I held my breath, listening. Silence. Maybe a branch, maybe an animal. Then, another tap. This time, deliberate, like fingertips. I squeezed my eyes shut. The old man's words echoed in my head. Don't look outside. I wanted to. I needed to. But something in my gut told me, if I did, I'd regret it. I didn't move. Didn't breathe. The tap came again. Soft, patient, right against the window near the couch. I told myself it was nothing. A tree branch, a bird, something normal. But deep down I knew better. I gripped the blanket draped over me, forcing myself to stay still. If I ignored it, maybe it would go away. Minutes passed, silence, I exhaled slowly, my heartbeat still racing. Maybe it had been my imagination. Maybe. Then the doorknob rattled. A sharp, quick jiggle, like someone testing if it was locked. My entire body locked up. It wasn't the wind, wasn't a branch. Someone was out there. I squeezed my eyes shut, gripping the armrest of the couch so tightly my fingers ached. Then, from the other side of the door, a whisper, low, amused. "Are you awake?" I wanted to scream, wanted to run, but I couldn't move. The voice was too close, right outside the door. Low, wrong. It wasn't asking, it was taunting. I bit my lip, willing myself to stay silent. "Don't answer, don't move." The doorknob rattled again, harder this time. Then 3 slow knocks, deliberate, expectant. I clutched my phone, my fingers trembling. No service, of course. I tried to steady my breathing, but it was impossible. Then the whisper came again. Closer, "You can let me in." I ran. I don't know when my body started moving, but suddenly, I was bolting down the hall, my bare feet barely making a sound against the wooden floor. The knocks came again, harder. The door shook in its frame. I reached the bedroom, slamming the door shut and locking it. Then silence. No knocks, no whispers, just the quiet hum of my own ragged breathing. I pressed my back against the door, heart hammering against my ribs. Then, a slow creak, not from my door, from the hallway, the floorboards. Someone was inside. My blood turned to ice. I had locked the front door, hadn't I? A footstep, then another, moving slowly down the hall. I clamped a hand over my mouth, forcing myself not to scream. The footsteps stopped, right outside the bedroom. Then, a quiet, shallow breath. Something was standing on the other side, waiting, listening, knowing I was in here. I squeezed my eyes shut. Then, the doorknob twisted. The lock held, but the knob kept turning, testing. Then, a scratching sound, slow, deliberate, like fingernails dragging against the wood. I choked on a breath, curling into myself. Then, a whisper, from the other side, soft, almost playful. "You locked me out." A pause. Then, "That's okay." A slow tap, tap, tap against the door. "I'll wait." I didn't sleep, didn't move. For hours, I sat in the corner of the room, back pressed against the wall, listening, waiting, but nothing else happened. Eventually, morning came. The golden light filtered through the window, making the nightmare of last night feel distant. But the fear didn't leave. Slowly, carefully, I crept toward the bedroom door. My fingers hovered over the lock. Then, taking a deep breath, I turned it. The door swung open. The hallway was empty. But just outside my bedroom door, the wood was scratched, deep, jagged, like something had been trying to get in. I didn't stay in the cabin that night. I couldn't. Instead, I packed a bag, grabbed my keys, and drove into town. The small diner was mostly empty, save for an old man sitting near the window. The waitress, young, tired looking, took my order without much interest. But when I mentioned the cabin, she froze. "You're staying there?" she asked, voice low. I nodded. The old man by the window stiffened. I noticed the way his fingers curled against the table, the way his eyes darkened. "Did you hear it?" he asked. A chill crawled down my spine. "Hear what?" He exhaled slowly. "The knocking." I didn't answer, because I didn't have to. He already knew. The old man didn't say much after that. But before I left the diner, he stopped me, his hand cold, bony, clasped around my wrist. "If you see its face," he murmured. I swallowed hard. "What?" His grip tightened. "If you see its face, it's already too late." A chill spread through me. I pulled my hand away, muttering a quick goodbye before heading back to my car. The drive to the cabin felt longer. The trees pressed in closer, and the whole time I felt watched. Night came too fast. I locked the doors, checked the windows, left every light on. But it didn't matter, because at exactly 3:17 a.m., the knocks came again, slow, deliberate. I clenched my fists, forcing myself not to move. Then, a whisper, right outside the window. "I know you're awake." I clenched the blanket around me, my breath shallow, my entire body frozen. The whisper outside the window was too close, too certain. It knew I was awake. The knocking stopped, silence stretched, heavy and suffocating. Then, the whisper again. I saw you today. My stomach twisted. It had been watching me. In town, at the diner. I squeezed my eyes shut, every instinct screaming at me to not look. Don't open the curtain. Don't move. Don't make a sound. Then, a tap, right against the glass, soft, patient. Then another, and another. It was waiting. I don't know how long I sat there.
Emits.
Hours. The knocking never came back. The whispering stopped, but the feeling remained. That crushing, suffocating weight in the air. The moment the sun rose, I bolted for the door. The woods were eerily silent. As I stepped outside, my breath fogging in the cold morning air, I forced myself to turn around, to look at the cabin. And that's when I saw it. The footprints, they started at my bedroom window and led directly to the front door. I packed my bags. I was done. I didn't care about the money. I didn't care about my agreement with Mr. Harrison. I just wanted to leave. I threw my stuff into the car, heart pounding, mind racing. Then, a voice from the tree line. You're leaving. I spun. A man stood at the edge of the woods, tall, thin. His clothes were wrong, old, tattered, like they didn't belong to this time. My throat went dry. Who are you? He smiled. You already know. I stumbled backward, my pulse hammering. No, I whispered. You're not real. His smile didn't falter. I've been waiting for you, he said. My stomach twisted. What? His head tilted slightly. You didn't look. That's good. I swallowed hard. But you heard me. A pause. Then softly. And now, you belong to me. I bolted for the car, threw the door open, sped down the road, gravel flying behind me. I didn't stop, not even when I saw him, standing in the middle of the road, miles ahead, smiling, waiting. I didn't go home, didn't go back to town. I just drove, for hours, days. But no matter how far I went, the knocking never stopped. Not on my bedroom window, not on motel doors, not on the walls of my car. And every night, at 3:17 a.m., the whisper came, low, amused. I found you, and I knew I would never be alone again. I never wanted to come back here. Not to this town, not to this house. But when my grandfather died, I didn't have a choice. The old man had left everything to me. His land, his house, all the relics of a life I barely knew. It felt wrong, claiming an inheritance from someone I had only met a handful of times. But I needed a fresh start. And this house, sitting on the edge of a dense, endless forest, was the only place left to go. The drive was long, too long. The road wound through thick trees, the pavement cracked with age, the woods pressing in closer with every mile. It had been years since I'd been here, since my mother had packed us up and left in the middle of the night, without a word of explanation. She had never spoken about my grandfather, never told me why we left, just that we had to go. And now she was gone too. The last of my family, which meant I was alone, with this house, with his secrets. I arrived at dusk. The cabin was exactly as I remembered. Tall, dark wood, a slanted roof, the windows like black eyes staring out at the tree line. Nothing had changed, except maybe me. I stepped out of the car, the air thick with the scent of damp earth and pine. The forest stretched behind the house, the treetops swallowing the last bit of daylight. It felt wrong, too still, too quiet. I shook it off and grabbed my bags. This was just a house, just a place to sleep. At least, that's what I told myself. The inside was dust-covered, the furniture draped in white sheets, like ghosts frozen in place. The air was stale, untouched for years. I wandered through the rooms, memories flickering in the corners of my vision. Faint, unfinished things. The hallway creaked beneath my feet as I reached the back door. Beyond it, the woods stretched for miles. My grandfather had told me once, the forest doesn't end. Not really. It just swallows you whole. At the time, I thought he had been telling a story. I wasn't so sure anymore. I locked the doors, checked the windows, tried to settle in. But sleep didn't come easy, because deep in the night, somewhere beyond the trees, I heard it, a low, distant knocking, coming from the forest, and it was getting closer. The knocking was slow, deliberate, faint at first, like it was deep in the forest, echoing through the trees. Then, it grew louder, closer, rhythmic, like knuckles rapping against wood. Knock, knock, knock. I sat up in bed, my breath shallow. My room was completely dark, save for the dim glow of the moon filtering through the curtains. The house was silent, except for that sound. I reached for my phone. No service. Of course. The knocking continued. Knock, 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 knock. I forced myself to move, slipping out of bed and creeping toward the window. My fingers trembled as I pulled the curtain aside, just enough to peek outside. The trees swayed in the wind, the shadows stretching long over the yard. Nothing, but the sound. It was still there, knocking, from the edge of the woods. I tried to convince myself it was an animal, a tree branch, anything but what my gut told me. Something was out there, and it was coming closer. I turned away from the window, my heart hammering. I needed to ignore it. Whatever this was, it wanted me to listen. I crawled back into bed, pulling the covers over my head like a child, tried to steady my breathing, tried to pretend I wasn't hearing it. Knock, 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 knock. The pattern never changed, like it was waiting. I don't know how long I lay there, frozen, maybe an hour, maybe longer, and then the knocking stopped. I exhaled. Silence. For the first time in hours, I felt like I could breathe. I let my eyes drift closed. Sleep started to take me. And then, a single knock, right outside my bedroom door. The knock at my bedroom door was soft. Too soft, like the knuckles had barely touched the wood. I stopped breathing. My fingers clenched the sheets so tight. My knuckles ached. I wanted to tell myself I had imagined it, that I had dozed off for a second, and my mind was playing tricks on me. But I knew better. This was real, and I wasn't alone. The air in the room was different now. Thicker, heavy, like something was pressing against me, waiting for me to react. The knock came again, just once, tap, then a long, slow inhale, right outside the door, like something was smelling me. I shoved a hand over my mouth, forcing myself not to make a sound. My pulse thundered in my ears, drowning out everything else. Another knock, then a whisper. "You're awake, aren't you?" My stomach turned. The voice was wrong, low, slurred, like someone trying to remember how human speech was supposed to sound. I clamped my eyes shut, didn't move, didn't answer. The whisper came again, closer this time. "Open the door." I shook my head, even though it couldn't see me. Then, a long silence, like it was thinking, deciding. Then, the doorknob started to turn. I launched myself out of bed, heart pounding. The knob twisted slowly, the lock holding, but just barely. I took a step back, my breathing ragged. Another step. Then, I grabbed the heavy wooden chair from the corner of the room and wedged it under the doorknob. I barely had time to step back before, bang, something slammed against the door. I nearly screamed. Another bang, then another. The whole door shook. The whispers came back, low and rhythmic. "Let me in, let me in, let me in." I pressed myself against the wall, my nails digging into my palms. The banging stopped. Silence. Then, something scraped down the door. Long, slow fingernails dragging down the wood. I clenched my teeth, biting back a sob. Then, a final whisper. So close I swore. I felt the breath through the wood. "I'll see you soon." And just like that, the presence was gone. I stayed awake for the rest of the night, listening, waiting, but the knocking never came back. Not that night. But somehow I knew. This wasn't over. Not even close. I didn't leave my room until the sun was up. Even then, I moved slowly, cautiously, like something might still be waiting for me. I pressed my ear against the door. Silence. Then, inch by inch, I pushed it open. The hallway was empty, but something was wrong. The air was stale, thick with a scent I didn't recognize, like earth, damp wood, something old. And then, I saw them. The scratches, deep, jagged marks carved into the outside of my bedroom door, like fingernails had been digging at the wood all night. A shiver crawled down my spine. I took a slow step forward. The floor creaked beneath my weight. The rest of the house was exactly how I had left it, except for one thing. The front door was unlocked. I froze. I knew I had locked it. I had checked it twice. And yet there it was, ajar, open just a crack, the morning breeze pushing it back and forth. My hands trembled as I reached for it, hesitating before finally pressing it shut. Click, locked. Again. I stepped away, tried to shake the unease building in my chest. Maybe I had forgotten. Maybe. But then I saw it, on the floor, right in front of the door. A single perfect handprint, pressed into the dust. It wasn't mine. I grabbed my phone. Still no service. Of course. I paced the living room, trying to think. I could leave, but where would I go? Town was an hour away. And this house, this property, was mine now. I had nowhere else. I checked the locks again, made coffee. I didn't drink, tried to shake the feeling that I was still being watched. Then, a thought struck me. I turned toward the old bookshelf in the corner. I had barely looked through my grandfather's things since arriving. Maybe there was something here, something that explained what was happening. I scanned the dusty shelves, mostly old books, faded papers, nothing useful, until I spotted a wooden box tucked away in the back, small, unmarked. I pulled it out, my fingers shaking slightly, as I flipped the lid open. Inside, an old yellowed notebook. I flipped to the first page, scrawled in my grandfather's messy handwriting. If you're reading this, it means you've heard the knocking. My breath caught. I flipped the page, my heart racing. The next line made my stomach drop. Whatever you do, don't let it see you. I stared at the words. Whatever you do, don't let it see you. My hands trembled as I flipped through the notebook. The pages were old, yellowed, filled with rushed, erratic handwriting. Some entries were barely legible, smudged, torn, as if my grandfather had written them in a hurry. But the message was clear. He had heard the knocking too. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to keep reading. The next entry was dated nearly 30 years ago. It comes at night, always at night. The knocking starts far away, then it moves closer. I tried to ignore it. That was my first mistake. My stomach twisted. The more you listen, the more it knows you're aware. The more you acknowledge it, the stronger it gets. I flipped the page. Never look outside. Never open the door. And for God's sake, never let it see your face. A shiver crawled down my spine. The way my grandfather wrote, it wasn't just fear. It was desperation. Like he had been trying to warn someone, trying to warn me. A gust of wind rattled the windows. I snapped the notebook shut, my pulse hammering. I needed to get out of here. But even as the thought crossed my mind, something stopped me. An instinct, or maybe a feeling, like if I stepped outside, something would be waiting, watching. I clenched my jaw, gripping the edges of the notebook. I had two choices, run or stay. I wasn't sure which was worse. I checked the time, 4:45 p.m., a few hours until dark. I didn't want to be in this house when night fell. I made a decision. I was going to town, at least for the night. I grabbed my keys, my bag, the notebook, but as I reached for the door, I hesitated. Something felt off. The air in the house had changed again. Like I wasn't alone. I turned slowly, my breath catching in my throat. The hallway leading to my bedroom was darker than before, too dark, like the shadows had stretched. I took a slow step back, then another. My fingers hovered over the doorknob. Then, knock, a single deliberate sound, not from the door, from inside the house. The knock came from the hallway, from the direction of my bedroom. I froze. The house was silent, but something was there. I could feel it. Waiting, watching. The hairs on my arms stood on end as I took another slow step back. Then, a whisper, low, drawn out. Don't go. My stomach twisted. The voice came from the hallway, from the darkness beyond my bedroom door. I should have run, should have bolted out of the house, but I was rooted in place, because something was wrong. The whisper, it sounded familiar, like a voice I used to know, a voice I hadn't heard in years, my mother's. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The voice came again. Why are you leaving? I clenched my jaw, took another step back. My mother was dead, had been dead for years. This wasn't her, it was something else, something trying to sound like her, and I wasn't going to listen. I reached for the door handle, turned it, pulled the door open. Then the voice changed, no longer soft, no longer familiar. Now it was low, wrong, inhuman. If you leave, it will follow. I slammed the door behind me and ran. I didn't stop until I was in my car. Didn't breathe until the house was far behind me. The dirt road stretched ahead, winding through the trees. I pressed the gas harder. I didn't care about the speed, didn't care about anything except getting away. The notebook sat on the passenger seat, the pages still open. I kept glancing at it, my mind racing. It will follow. Was that true? Was I making a mistake by leaving? I didn't know. I didn't care. I just needed to see other people, to feel normal, to be anywhere but that house. The town was small, nothing more than a gas station, a diner, and a few shops lining the main street. I pulled into the diner's parking lot, my hands still shaking. Inside, the place was nearly empty. A waitress behind the counter, an old man in the corner, a couple sitting near the window, speaking in hushed tones. I sat at the bar, rubbing my temples. The waitress walked over, pouring me a cup of coffee. "You okay?" she asked, giving me a look. I hesitated. Then I downed. I just needed to get out of the house. Her expression shifted. Her smile faltered. "Which house?" she asked. I swallowed. "The old cabin, the one past the tree line." The old man in the corner stiffened. The couple near the window stopped talking. And then, the waitress took a slow step back. Her hands trembled slightly as she set the coffee pot down. "You need to leave," she said. My stomach dropped. "What?" She leaned in, her voice low. "You shouldn't have come here. You shouldn't have left the house." I stared at her. "What the hell are you talking about?" She didn't answer. She just nodded toward the window. "Because now it knows where you are." The waitress's words hit me like a punch to the gut. "Because now it knows where you are." I swallowed hard, gripping the edge of the counter. "What do you mean?" My voice came out quieter than I wanted it to. She shook her head. "You shouldn't have left. That place, it keeps things inside. If you're out here, that means it's out here too." My stomach twisted. "That's not possible." It was just I stopped myself, because I didn't believe that. I had heard it. I had felt it. The scratching at my door, the voice in the hallway, and now the feeling in this diner. The way everyone had stopped talking when I mentioned the house. The old man in the corner set down his coffee cup, his hands unsteady. He finally spoke, his voice rough with age. "It doesn't like when people leave," he said. "Not once they've heard the knocking." I felt a cold weight settle in my chest. "You've heard it too, haven't you?" I whispered. He nodded, a long, slow nod. And then, just as softly, he said, "And I've been running ever since." The entire diner was too quiet. The air was thick with something unspoken. I looked around, my pulse hammering. The couple near the window was staring at me. The waitress stepped back, gripping the edge of the counter like she was bracing herself. And then, I felt it. A presence, outside, watching. The feeling was so overwhelming that I didn't want to look, didn't want to see what was standing beyond the glass. But my eyes moved on their own. I turned, looked out the window, and my blood turned to ice, because standing beneath the streetlight, half hidden in the shadows, was a figure. Tall, too thin, too still. Its head was tilted slightly, like it was studying me. The light flickered, and in that brief moment, I saw its face. It was me. I couldn't breathe. The figure outside the diner. It wasn't just watching me. It was me. The same face, the same clothes, but the eyes, wrong. empty, like something wearing my skin. I grabbed the counter, forcing my voice to work. "Do you see that?" I whispered. The old man didn't answer. Neither did the waitress, because they didn't have to. I could tell by the way their faces had paled, by the way the couple near the window turned away, like they were afraid to look, like they already knew. My hands trembled. As I turned back to the window, the figure hadn't moved, hadn't blinked. It just stood there, waiting. Then the light flickered again, and it was closer. I stumbled back, my pulse hammering in my ears. It was too close now, standing just beyond the glass, its head still tilted. That same empty stare fixed on me, but its mouth, it had started to move. No sound, no voice, just the slow, silent motion of lips forming words, words I couldn't hear. But I understood, it was saying my name, over, and over, and over. The old man grabbed my wrist, his grip stronger than I expected. "We need to leave." The waitress nodded, her face drawn and tight. "You can't stay here," she said. "But if I go outside?" The old man shook his head. "You don't have a choice," he whispered, and the way he said it, the finality in his voice, made me realize something. I had already made a mistake. The moment I looked at it, the moment I recognized its face, I had let it in. The air inside the diner shifted. It felt heavy now, like something unseen had slipped through the cracks of reality, pressing down on my chest. I clenched my fists, my breath shallow. Outside, the thing wearing my face was still watching, still whispering my name in silent, soundless movements. And with every flicker of the streetlight, it was getting closer. The waitress grabbed my arm. "We have to go," she hissed. The old man was already standing, his shoulders hunched, his eyes locked on the door. My feet wouldn't move. My pulse slammed against my ribs. "If we go outside, it'll see. You don't understand." The old man cut in. His voice was deadly serious. "If we stay here, we're trapped with it." I didn't understand. Not completely, but the look in his eyes, raw fear, the kind that had settled into his bones over years of running, told me everything I needed to know. There was no safety, not inside, not outside. It was already here, waiting for me to realize it. The lights inside the diner flickered, once, twice, then the power cut out. I froze. The only light now was the dim glow from the street lamps outside. The empty hum of silence filled the air. Then, a sound, not from outside, from behind me, slow, wet, like something dragging itself across the floor. My stomach turned. I didn't want to look. I couldn't. The old man grabbed my arm. His fingernails dug into my skin. "Don't move." My pulse hammered. The dragging sound came closer. And then, the whisper, "Not outside, not at the window, but right behind me. I found you." The old man yanked me toward the exit. We stumbled through the dark, the diner's layout suddenly foreign. The air was thick with something unseen, something that pressed against my skin like static. I could feel it, not behind me anymore, not outside the window, but everywhere. The couple near the window was gone. I didn't see them leave, didn't hear them move, just gone, like they had never been there at all, like they had been erased. The waitress was the first to reach the door. Her hands fumbled with the lock. Her breath was ragged. "Hurry," she whispered. Behind us, the dragging sound stopped. A pause. Then something exhaled. Long, slow, like it had been holding its breath. The door swung open, and the last thing I heard before stepping into the cold night air was a voice, low, laughing. We stumbled onto the street, gasping for breath. The old man didn't stop, didn't hesitate. "Get in the car." I didn't argue. I sprinted toward my car, fingers shaking as I fumbled for the keys. The waitress climbed into her own car. The old man threw open the passenger door of mine, his movements urgent, desperate. I turned the ignition. The headlights flooded the road in front of me. The beams landed on the street lamp, and the thing that still stood beneath it, still smiling, still whispering my name. But now, its head was tilted at an unnatural angle, too far, like its neck had broken. A slow twitching motion rippled through its limbs, and then, with horrifying deliberate slowness, it lifted a hand and waved. I slammed the gas. The car lurched forward, tires screeching as we peeled onto the road. The streetlights blurred past us, the dark expanding in every direction. I didn't look back. I couldn't. My hands tightened on the wheel. The waitress's car followed behind, her headlights bouncing along the cracked road. We didn't speak, didn't breathe, didn't even think. We just drove, and as we fled that town, the feeling remained, that horrible, undeniable certainty, that we weren't alone, that something had followed us, that it wasn't over, not yet, not even close. The road stretched ahead, endless and dark. I didn't know where we were going, didn't care. I just kept driving. The old man sat in the passenger seat, his face pale, his hands trembling in his lap. The waitress's car followed close behind, her headlights barely visible through the rearview mirror. For a while, none of us spoke. The only sound was the steady hum of the tires against the cracked pavement. Then the old man exhaled, rubbing his face. You looked at it, didn't you? His voice was low, flat, like he already knew the answer. I gripped the wheel, swallowed hard. Yes, the old man shut his eyes, his hands clenched into fists. Then it won't stop. A shiver crawled down my spine. I already knew that. I just didn't want to believe it. A sign appeared ahead, barely visible in the dim headlights. Motel 3 miles. I took the turn. Without hesitation, the gas gauge was dangerously low, and I needed all of us needed to get off the road. I didn't know if stopping was a mistake, didn't know if resting would make us more vulnerable, but we couldn't run forever. And somehow, deep in my gut, I knew it was already too late. The motel was as empty as the town had been. A single neon sign flickered, buzzing in the quiet night air. Vacancy. I parked. The waitress pulled in beside me. None of us moved at first. We just sat there, breathing, staring at the building. Finally, the old man reached for the door handle. This place won't be safe for long, he muttered, but it'll give us a few hours. I didn't ask him how he knew. I just followed, because something in the air felt wrong, like we were being expected, like something had already followed us inside. The motel clerk barely looked at us, didn't ask questions, didn't even seem to register how pale and shaken we were. 2 rooms, the old man said. The clerk nodded, slid 2 rusty keys across the counter. His fingers were gray, sickly, his nails too long. I didn't ask, didn't want to ask, because something about him bet this place felt off. We took the keys and left. The hallway was too quiet. The air smelled stale. The waitress whispered as we reached the doors, "Did you see his hands?" I didn't answer, because I had. The rooms were identical. Stiff beds, peeling wallpaper, a single lamp buzzing in the corner. The old man and I took one room. The waitress took the other. Neither of us bothered unpacking. I sat on the bed, staring at the floor. My hands wouldn't stop shaking. The old man sat across from me, watching, waiting. Then, "It's going to find us again." I swallowed. I know. His jaw clenched. He leaned forward, voice lower, colder. Then, "We need to stop running." The wind howled outside. Branches scraped against the window like fingernails. The room was too cold, like something had slipped in with us. The old man rubbed his temples. I could see the exhaustion in his face, the kind that comes from years of running. And suddenly, I knew. He had been through this before, had barely escaped, and he was tired of it. "I've seen it take people," he muttered. His eyes were haunted. "They don't die. They just disappear." A chill settled over me. I thought about the couple in the diner, how they had been there one moment, and gone the next, like they had never existed, like the world had just erased them. I clenched my fists. "We have to stop it." The old man's gaze lifted to mine. His face was grim. "Then we have to go back." "Back," I echoed. The word tasted wrong on my tongue. The very thought of returning to that house made my stomach churn. But I knew, somewhere, deep down, that he was right. It had all started there, and it would end there too. I exhaled, nodded. The old man's eyes darkened. "We don't have much time," he muttered. Outside, the wind howled louder. Something shifted beyond the walls. The air turned thick, heavy, and then, the knocking came. Slow, rhythmic. From the walls, the ceiling, the floor, like it was all around us, like it had been waiting for us to stop moving, to let our guard down. The old man's voice was urgent. "We need to leave. Now." We ran. Didn't stop. Didn't look back. The hallway stretched longer than before. The lights flickered overhead. The knocking followed us. Every wall, every door, like the whole building was alive, like it was trying to keep us inside. The old man reached the exit first, threw the door open. The night swallowed us whole. The waitress gasped for air, clutching her chest. I turned back just once, and through the glass door, I saw them. Figures, tall, thin, standing in the hallway, watching, waiting. Then they stepped forward, and the motel lights went out. We never stopped driving. The old man had been right. We had to end it, and that meant going back, to the house, to the forest, to where it all began. Because this thing, it wasn't just hunting me. It was growing, it was spreading, and if we didn't stop it, it would never stop. Not until it took everything, not until it took us all. I never thought I'd return to Old Briar Road. Not after what happened all those years ago. Not after everything we saw. But when my uncle died, leaving his rotting house in my name, I didn't have a choice. The lawyer told me the place had been abandoned for years, that no one had lived there since the night my uncle went missing. They never found a body, never found anything. One night, he was just gone. And now the house, the place I swore I'd never set foot in again, belonged to me. The drive there was longer than I remembered. The road twisted through thick woods. The pavement cracked with age. The trees looming high over the narrow lanes. By the time I reached the turnoff, the sky had darkened, the last bit of daylight fading behind the treetops. I hesitated before making the final turn. The driveway was overgrown, the weeds reaching halfway up the rusted gate. The house beyond it sat in the middle of a clearing, its shape barely visible against the blackening sky. It looked wrong, like something that had been left to rot for too long. And yet, as I stared at it, I felt something else, a pull, a sense of recognition, like the house was waiting for me, like it knew I'd be back. And deep down I knew I was never supposed to leave it in the first place. I pushed open the rusted gate. It groaned, the sound piercing the silence. The front yard was a mess of weeds and dead grass, the air thick with the scent of damp earth, and something else, something I couldn't quite place. I stepped onto the porch, my footsteps echoing against the rotting wood. The front door was still locked, which made no sense, because my uncle had been alone when he disappeared. And yet, the house had been sealed from the outside. My stomach twisted. I reached for the old brass key, my fingers trembling as I slid it into the lock. It clicked too easily, like it had just been waiting for me. I swallowed hard. Then, I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The air was thick, heavy, like the house had been holding its breath for years. Dust coated every surface, the furniture draped in white sheets, giving the illusion of frozen ghosts. The living room was just as I remembered. Tall windows, an old fireplace, a single hallway leading deeper into the house. The air smelled of rotting wood, of something forgotten. I took another step forward, my shoe scuffing against the old floorboards, and that's when I heard it. A soft creak, not from me, not from the wind, from deeper in the house. I went still, listening, holding my breath. The sound came again, a slow shuffling step. My pulse pounded in my ears. The house was empty. It had been empty for years, and yet, something was moving inside. I should have left, should have turned around, locked the door behind me, and never come back. But I didn't, because part of me, a small terrible part of me, needed to know. I followed the hallway, the air growing colder with each step. The walls stretched on longer than I remembered, the doorways gaping too wide, like the house had grown, like it had been waiting for someone to walk deeper inside. Then, I saw it, the door to the basement. It was open, just a crack, and from the darkness below, something breathed. I stopped, Every instinct in my body screamed not to go down there. I gripped the doorknob, heart hammering. The breath from below was slow, measured, like something was waiting, like something had been waiting for years. I leaned closer, and then, a whisper, so close I felt it against my skin. "You shouldn't have come back." I stumbled back, slamming the door shut. My hands trembled as I locked it. Then, silence. The air in the house shifted. The presence was still there. I could feel it, listening, waiting, and then the knocking started. It came from the basement door, slow, deliberate, knuckles dragging against the wood. I backed away, my breath caught in my throat. Then, another knock. I reached for my phone. No service. Of course. Knock, knock. The sound was steady, rhythmic, like it was, patient, like it knew I had nowhere to go. I clenched my fists. I wasn't staying here. I didn't care what legal papers said. This house didn't want me here. And I sure as hell wasn't staying the night. I turned toward the door, and that's when I noticed the footprints. They led from the basement, trailing through the dust, clear, fresh, leading directly to where I was standing. My heart stopped. The knocking had stopped, too. The house had gone completely silent. But somehow, I knew I wasn't alone. I turned my head slowly, and then, a breath, right behind me. I ran. I didn't think, didn't hesitate. The second I felt that breath against my neck, I ran. The front door was only a few feet away, the hallway stretching out before me, longer than it should have been. The walls seemed to shift around me, the air growing thicker with every step. I reached for the handle, my fingers slipping against the cold brass. I pulled. The door wouldn't budge. My breath hitched. I yanked harder. The lock wasn't stuck. It wasn't jammed. It was like the door itself was holding firm, like it didn't want me to leave. Then, behind me, the floor creaked. I squeezed my eyes shut. "Don't turn around." The words screamed in my head, but my body wasn't listening. Slowly, stiffly, I turned. The hallway was empty, but the air felt wrong. The kind of wrong that makes your skin crawl. The kind of wrong that tells you you're being watched. Then, knock, knock. The basement door. The sound echoed through the house, low and deliberate, like someone was knocking from the inside. The moment I stepped forward, the knocking stopped, and a voice whispered, "Stay." No, no, I wasn't doing this. I turned back to the front door, and slammed my fist against it. "Let me out," I shouted. Silence. Then, another knock. But this time, it didn't come from the basement. It came from the window. I sucked in a breath, turning my head. At first I saw nothing, just my own reflection in the glass, the dark trees swaying behind me. But then, something else moved, just barely, just behind me. I felt it before I saw it. A shape in the reflection, standing directly behind me. Too tall, too thin, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. I spun around. Nothing. But the second I turned back to the glass, the figure was closer, smiling, and it had my face. I stumbled backward, my breath ragged. No, this wasn't real. I had to get out of here. I turned toward the stairs, desperate to find another way out. The moment my foot hit the first step, the whisper came again, soft, right against my ear. I said, "Stay." Then the lights went out. Everything plunged into darkness. The house groaned around me, the air thick and suffocating. I held my breath, listening. The only sound was the wind howling through the trees outside. Then a new sound, a soft, wet dragging, coming from the hallway. My stomach twisted. I wasn't alone anymore. Something was moving, slowly, deliberately, coming closer. I backed away, my fingers scrambling for the railing. My body screamed at me to run, but I couldn't see, couldn't move. And then the whisper returned, from the darkness. "I see you." I bolted. I didn't care where I was running. I just ran. I sprinted up the stairs, my breath ragged, my legs burning. The air behind me shifted, like something had started chasing me. I reached the upstairs hallway, heart hammering. The doors on either side of me were slightly open, like something had been waiting inside them, watching me as I ran past. Then, a sharp creak behind me, I whipped my head around and nearly screamed, because at the bottom of the stairs, standing in the dark, was me, not a reflection, not a shadow. It was me, grinning, slowly tilting its head, and then, it moved. It didn't run, didn't lunge, it just walked, slow deliberate steps, like it had all the time in the world. I yanked open the nearest door, and stumbled inside. The room was cold, the air smelled wrong, like damp earth, like something had been rotting in here for years. I slammed the door shut behind me, my hands fumbling for the lock. Click, locked. My breath came fast and shallow. I pressed my ear against the wood, listening. Silence. Then, tap, tap, fingertips, dragging slowly against the door. Then, a single breathy whisper, "You can't hide." I backed away from the door, tried to calm my breathing, tried to think. I had two choices, stay here and wait, or find another way out. Then, I noticed something worse, the closet door. It was open, just slightly, and from the darkness inside, something shifted. I wasn't alone in here. The air turned thick, heavy, like something else was breathing in the room with me. My pulse hammered. I took a slow step back. Then, the closet door creaked wider. I saw a shape, tall, wrong, its limbs too long. I didn't wait. I lunged for the window, yanking it open. The cold air hit me hard. I didn't think, didn't hesitate. I climbed onto the ledge, and jumped. I hit the ground hard, my ankle twisting painfully, but I didn't stop. I forced myself up. The wind screamed around me, the trees swaying violently. I turned back toward the house, and froze. The window I had just jumped from. Someone was standing there, staring down at me, wearing my face. Then it smiled, and slowly it pressed a hand against the glass, leaving behind a bloody handprint. I ran. I didn't look back, didn't stop until I reached my car, my fingers shaking as I fumbled for the keys. The headlights flooded the yard. But the house, it was empty again. No one at the window, no bloody handprint, like nothing had happened at all. But I knew, something was still in there. And worse, it wasn't done with me yet. I didn't stop driving, didn't slow down, didn't look back. The house was a shrinking shadow in the rearview mirror, swallowed by the twisting trees lining Old Briar Road. But the further I drove, the heavier the air became, like I was carrying something with me. Something invisible, something that refused to be left behind. I gripped the steering wheel, my knuckles white. I had escaped, hadn't I? Then, my phone buzzed. I flinched so hard, I nearly veered off the road. There was no service out here. And yet, a new notification had appeared on my screen. No name, no number, just a single message. You left something behind. My breath hitched. I glanced at the road ahead, heart hammering. I hadn't told anyone I was coming out here, hadn't contacted anyone. And yet, someone knew. I hesitated. Then, with trembling fingers, I typed a response. Who is this? For a long time nothing happened. I kept driving, the darkness stretching endlessly ahead. Then, another buzz, another message. Look in the back seat. A chill crawled down my spine. My hands tightened on the wheel. I didn't want to look, didn't want to see what was waiting for me. But slowly, I turned my head. The back seat was empty, but the air had changed. The car suddenly felt smaller, like something unseen was taking up space. I forced my gaze back to the road, my pulse thundering. Maybe it was a prank, maybe my mind was playing tricks on me. Then, the phone buzzed again. I swallowed hard. Another message. Are you sure? I nearly slammed on the brakes. My breath hitched, my fingers going numb. I wanted to throw the phone away, wanted to stop the car and run. But there was nowhere to go, nowhere that was safe. Not anymore. I stole another glance in the rearview mirror, and for the briefest second, I saw something, a shape, a shadow, tall, too tall, sitting in the middle of the back seat, still watching. Then, the headlights flickered, and it was gone. I kept driving. My mind was screaming at me to turn around, to leave the car, and run. But run where? The house, the motel. No place was safe. And deep down I knew that now. I reached the highway, the town's distant glow flickering on the horizon. But even as I approached civilization, the feeling didn't leave. That weight in my chest, that suffocating presence, something was still with me. And when I glanced back at my phone, there was one final message. You can't leave. You belong to it now. The motel parking lot was nearly empty. The neon sign buzzed faintly, casting flickering shadows across the cracked pavement. I sat in the car, my hands shaking against the wheel. I had been driving for hours, but I didn't feel any further away. If anything, it felt like I had been going in circles, like the house was pulling me back. I needed sleep, needed a break from the whispers in my head, the footsteps I kept imagining behind me. I grabbed my bag and stepped out of the car, the night air cold against my skin. The motel door was already open, as if someone had been waiting. The room smelled of dust and old wood. The furniture was outdated, the floral wallpaper peeling in the corners. But at least it was a bed. At least I could lock the door. I slid the bolt into place and leaned against it, exhaling, safe, for now. But as I stood there, my eyes adjusted to the dim glow of the bedside lamp, and I noticed something. The closet door. It was open, just a sliver, and inside the darkness, something moved. I stood frozen. A breath rasped from the closet, long, slow, like someone had been waiting in there for hours. I reached for my bag, my fingers closing around the pocket knife inside. The air in the room was too heavy, like something was pushing against me. I swallowed hard. Then, in a single motion, I kicked the closet door open. The light spilled inside, illuminating nothing. The space was empty. No one was there. And yet, the air inside was still warm, like something had just been standing there, watching me. I forced myself to breathe, shoved the closet shut. This wasn't real, couldn't be real. I was just tired, just imagining things. I climbed into bed, leaving the lamp on, my back pressed against the headboard. I just needed to sleep, just 1 hour. That's all. I closed my eyes, and then, right against my ear, a whisper, "Found you." I jerked awake. The room was pitch black. The lamp had gone out. My breath came in ragged gasps, my chest aching. I reached for my phone. The screen wouldn't turn on. The air felt wrong, heavy. Then, a slow, deliberate knock. Not at the door, not at the window. From under the bed, my stomach turned. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Another knock. Then, a whisper, from directly beneath me. "Don't look." The silence was worse than the knocking. My pulse thundered in my ears, my body frozen in place. I knew. If I looked under the bed, I wouldn't be looking at nothing. Something was under there, something waiting. I pressed my back against the wall, tried to think. The motel was empty. The parking lot had been empty. No one was coming to help. I was alone. Then, a hand slid out from beneath the bed, pale, wrong. Its fingers too long. It curled slowly against the carpet, and then, it started to pull itself out. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The hand dragged itself further out from under the bed, its fingers twitching, curling into the carpet like it was testing the ground. It wasn't frantic, it wasn't struggling. It was calm, like it knew I had nowhere to go. A second hand followed. Then, an arm. The skin was pale, stretched too tight over the bones. The fingers were too long, the joints bending at unnatural angles. A sickening crack filled the room as the arms twisted, pulling something closer. I swallowed hard, pressing myself against the headboard, my fingers digging into the sheets. I didn't want to see, didn't want to know what came next. But my eyes wouldn't look away. Then the head emerged. I squeezed my eyes shut, but it didn't matter. I could hear it moving, bones creaking under its weight, joints snapping into place. As it pulled itself from the darkness beneath the bed, the air grew thick. The smell of damp, rotting wood filled my lungs. I felt it before I saw it. Something tall, something wrong, standing at the foot of the bed. I forced myself to open my eyes, and the moment I did, it tilted its head, its mouth stretched too wide, and it spoke, with my voice. "You shouldn't have left the house. The voice was perfect, not distorted, not hollow. It sounded exactly like me, like something had stolen my voice, like something had been practicing. I clamped a hand over my mouth, my heart slamming against my ribs. The thing in front of me didn't move, didn't lunge. It just stood there, watching, waiting. Then, it took a step forward. I scrambled off the bed, didn't think, didn't hesitate. I ran, threw myself at the motel door, my hands fumbling with the lock. The knob felt slick, wet, like something had been holding it before me. My stomach twisted. I shoved my shoulder against the door, my breath ragged. Behind me, the thing moved, not fast, not in a rush, just following, like it already knew there was nowhere to go. I yanked the door open and bolted into the night. The parking lot was empty. The only sound was the distant buzz of the motel's neon sign. No other guests, no staff. It was like the world had forgotten this place existed. I stumbled forward, my pulse hammering. The cold air burned my lungs, but I didn't stop, didn't slow down. I had to get to the car, had to get away. But as I reached the driver's side, I froze. The backseat door was open, wide, like someone had just stepped out, or worse, had been waiting inside. I took a shaky step back. My brain screamed at me to leave the car behind, to run. But where? The road stretched into blackness, lined with nothing but endless trees. There was nowhere to go, nowhere that was safe. And then, a voice, right behind me. "Where are you going?" I turned, and saw myself, standing in the motel doorway, smiling, its head tilted at that same unnatural angle. It knew I was trapped, and it was enjoying it. I took another step back. The thing wearing my face didn't follow. It just stood there, watching, like it was waiting for something. And that's when I realized it wasn't alone, because from the shadows of the motel hallway, more shapes began to emerge, tall, wrong, silent. They had been waiting too, and the moment I saw them, the motel lights flickered, and they moved. I ran, didn't look back, didn't breathe. I sprinted into the woods, the trees whipping past me, branches scratching my arms. The motel vanished behind me, but the feeling didn't leave. That heavy, suffocating presence, like something was right behind me, waiting for me to stop. I didn't. I just kept running. Then, a break in the trees, an opening, and beyond it, the house. I skidded to a stop, my stomach dropping. I had been running for miles. How was I back here? I turned, looked behind me. The woods stretched endlessly. The motel was gone, like it had never been there, like I had been running in one giant circle. And deep in my gut, I knew it had led me back. The front door of the house was open, just a crack, like it had been waiting, like it had always been waiting. I shook my head. No, I wasn't doing this. I turned back toward the trees, ready to run again. And then, something stepped out of the house. Tall still, it wasn't me this time. It was something else, a shadow, a thing that had been waiting inside. And when it spoke, the voice wasn't mine, wasn't human. It was many voices, all whispering at once. "Welcome home." I stood frozen. The thing in the doorway didn't move, didn't rush toward me. It just stood there, tall, too tall, like it had been waiting for me to come back, like it had always known I would. The voices inside it whispered in layers, low, high, some fast, some slow, all speaking at once. And somehow I understood every word. "You were never supposed to leave." My pulse thundered. I took a step back, but the air felt thick, like something was pressing against me, like I was walking against water. "We called for you." The voices were closer now, inside my head, inside everything. "And you answered." I forced my legs to move. I wasn't going back in that house. I wasn't playing whatever game this was. I turned back toward the forest, and stopped cold. The trees were wrong. The path I had just run through, gone. In its place, only darkness, like the world had been swallowed whole, like the house was the only thing left. "You can't run anymore." The voices slithered under my skin. "You never could." I clenched my fists. I had two choices: run or face it. My whole life, I had been running, first from this place, then from what had followed me, and now, there was nowhere left to go. I turned back to the house. The figure in the doorway was gone, but the door, it was open, wide now, like it had been expecting me, like it had been calling me home. I took a step forward, then another. The wind howled behind me, pushing me closer. The floorboards creaked as I stepped inside. The air smelled of rotting wood, of something old and waiting. The hallway stretched long, longer than before, like the house had grown. I stepped forward. The door slammed shut behind me. Darkness swallowed the room. I couldn't see, couldn't breathe. Then, a whisper, close, right against my ear. It's time. The walls groaned. The floor shifted beneath my feet. I reached for my phone. No service, no light, only the thick, suffocating darkness. Then, a noise, soft, wet, like something dragging itself across the wood, coming closer. I swallowed hard. I wasn't alone in here, and I wasn't the only thing that had returned. I took a slow step back. My breath hitched. The whispering had started again. But now, it wasn't just from the hallway. It was everywhere. Above me, below me, the walls, the floor, the house itself was whispering. And I realized, it had been waiting for me to come back, to finish what had started years ago. The whispers formed words, a chant, an invitation. Join us. I clenched my teeth. I had been afraid my whole life. Afraid of this place. Afraid of what I had seen. Afraid of what I had left behind. But now, I felt something else. A fire. A rage. I wasn't going to die here. Not like my uncle. Not like the others. I took a step forward, toward the whispering, and for the first time, it hesitated. I reached the basement door, the same one I had slammed shut the first night. Now, it was wide open. The air crawled with something unseen, something old, something hungry. I could hear breathing. Deep below, the stairs stretched into nothing, a pit of pure blackness, a place that shouldn't exist. And yet, I knew, I had to go down. Step by step, I descended. The whispers grew louder, the air thicker, the darkness tighter. Then, I reached the bottom, and I saw it, the heart of the house, a room lined with rotting wood and carved symbols. And in the center, a mirror, tall, ancient. Its glass was wrong, like looking into deep water. Shapes moved behind it, things that weren't me, things that had been watching me all along. I stepped closer. The whispers became one voice, not mine, not human, but something older, something that belonged to the house. This is where you belong. My reflection twisted, changed. It wasn't me anymore. It was one of them, a thing that had been waiting, and now, it wanted to pull me through. I reached forward, not to touch it, not to join them, but to end this. I pulled the notebook from my pocket, my grandfather's last words. The warning he had left me. I flipped to the final page. The words were shaky, rushed, but clear. Break the mirror, and don't look back. I grabbed the rusted iron poker from the corner of the room. The whispers screamed as I lifted it. The mirror shuddered. The things inside it crawled toward me. Reaching, I swung. The glass shattered. The sound split the air like a thunderclap. And suddenly, the house was screaming. Everything shook. The floor cracked. The air ripped apart. I turned and ran. The whispers became wails. Angry, desperate. The house was collapsing. I burst through the basement door. The walls buckled. The hallway twisted. I reached the front door, and behind me, something roared. A final, ear-splitting sound. And then, silence. I woke up in the dirt. The sun blinding. The house was gone. Nothing left but ashes. The wind stirred the dust, and for the first time, the air was quiet. The weight was gone. I was free, or at least, that's what I thought, until I saw the footprints, leading away from the ruins, fresh, following me, and I knew, it wasn't over, not yet, not ever. I should have listened to the warnings. I should have turned back the second I heard the first howl, but we were young, stupid, And now I don't think I'm getting out of these woods alive. It started as a simple camping trip. Me, my best friend Ryan, and two of his college buddies, Chris and Mark. We wanted something different for the weekend, something away from the city, away from people. Chris suggested Blackwood Forest. It was isolated, no cell service, no tourists, just miles and miles of untouched wilderness. And at the time, it sounded perfect. We packed our gear, loaded up Ryan's truck, and set off completely unaware of what was waiting for us. The drive up was long. The highway disappeared behind us, the roads turning to dirt and gravel. The deeper we went, the denser the trees became. The sun hung low in the sky, its light barely piercing through the thick canopy. Chris was navigating with an old map, tracing his finger along a winding path. "There's a spot up ahead," he said. "Not on any tourist trails. Supposed to be perfect for camping." Mark smirked. "You sound like a goddamn park ranger." Chris just shrugged. "My uncle used to hunt out here. Said this place is untouched land. A little creepy at night, though." Ryan scoffed. "Creepy how?" Chris hesitated. "Then, just stories." The road narrowed. The truck's tires kicked up dust. The trees pressing in closer. Something about the silence unsettled me. No birds, no wind rustling the leaves. Just the sound of our truck moving forward. Then, Chris pointed. "Turn here." Ryan frowned. "That's not a road." Chris grinned. "Exactly. It was barely a clearing. A gap in the trees, almost hidden by overgrown branches." Ryan hesitated, then turned. The truck rumbled forward, swallowed by the forest. We found the clearing right before sunset. A perfect spot, secluded, open, surrounded by thick trees. A small river ran nearby, the water dark and still. It should have felt peaceful, but something about this place felt off, like it had been waiting for us. We set up camp, unloading the gear, pitching the tents. The fire crackled, spitting embers into the night. For a while we laughed, drank, told stories. But then, Chris mentioned the legend, and everything changed. "You ever hear about the Blackwood Beast?" Ryan rolled his eyes. "Oh, here we go." Chris grinned, leaning in closer to the fire. "My uncle used to tell me this story," he said. "Said there's something living in these woods, something that only comes out on certain nights." Mark smirked, "Like a bear." Chris shook his head. "No, worse, bigger." The flames flickered, the shadows stretched. "Said it's got the body of a man, but twisted, taller, stronger. Its bones snap and break every time it moves, reshaping itself." My stomach tightened. I didn't like the way he was telling this story, like it was real, like he had seen it himself. Chris leaned forward. "My uncle told me he saw it once. When he was a kid." The fire crackled. "Said he was out here hunting with his dad. They found a buck torn apart, not eaten, just shredded." The night air felt colder. Chris's voice dropped to a whisper. "He said he saw something standing in the trees." Ryan exhaled, shaking his head. "Oh, come on." But I wasn't laughing. Neither was Mark. Chris's voice lowered. "My uncle said it had yellow eyes." The moment he said it, something moved in the trees. We all heard it. A branch snapping in the distance. A rustling sound. Slow, deliberate. The conversation stopped. The fire crackled. Silence hung in the air. Mark turned his head. "That wasn't the wind." Chris sat up. "No," Ryan scoffed. "Probably a deer." Chris didn't answer, because we all heard it again. Something moving. Something big. Just outside the fire's glow. Ryan sighed and stood. "I'll check it out." I grabbed his arm. "Don't." But he just laughed. "Relax, man. There's no such thing as werewolves." And then he walked into the trees. The fire flickered. Ryan's footsteps faded. Silence, the kind that makes your skin crawl. Mark shifted uncomfortably. "Dumbass is gonna get himself lost." Chris shook his head. "He should be back by now." And that's when we heard it. A howl. Not far. Not deep in the forest. Close. Low. Wrong. It wasn't a wolf. It wasn't a coyote. It was something else, something bigger. And it wasn't alone. We froze. The howl echoed through the trees, long and drawn out. Then, silence. Chris stood first. "This isn't right." I grabbed the flashlight. Ryan was still out there, somewhere, but I had a terrible feeling. He wasn't alone anymore. Mark cursed. We should go after him. Chris hesitated. Then, another sound. Not a howl this time. Something running, fast, through the leaves, coming right at us. Mark spun toward the trees. Ryan, no answer. Just the sound of footsteps, pounding against the dirt, getting closer. Then, Ryan burst from the woods. His face was pale, his breath ragged, and his shirt was covered in blood. He opened his mouth, then stopped, because behind him, the trees were moving. Something was coming, something huge, something hungry. And that's when we saw the eyes, burning yellow, watching us from the dark. And then, the thing howled. Ryan stood there, panting, covered in blood. His hands trembled at his sides, his eyes wide with terror. Run! His voice barely a whisper. Then, the trees exploded behind him. Something huge crashed through the undergrowth, branches snapping like bones. Yellow eyes glowed in the darkness. A snarl rumbled through the air, low and unnatural. Mark cursed. Chris grabbed his knife. But I didn't move, because I saw it, the thing in the trees. And it saw me. It was huge, at least 7 feet tall, its body covered in matted fur. But it wasn't a wolf. Not entirely. Its arms were too long. Its legs bent wrong, like it had been put together wrong. It crouched low, muscles rippling beneath the fur. Its jaws too wide, and it was smiling. Not an animal snarl, not a warning. A smile like it knew, like it was playing with us. Then, it lunged. Ryan screamed. We scattered. The fire roared, embers flying as we ran. Chris grabbed his knife, swinging wildly. Mark yanked the flashlight from the ground, its beam bouncing wildly. I grabbed Ryan, dragging him backward. The thing landed where we had been standing. Its claws tore through the dirt, sending up chunks of earth and stone. A deep guttural growl rattled in its throat. Its head snapped toward us. Its yellow eyes burned. Then, it stood upright, fully, like it had just remembered it could. My stomach twisted. It wasn't just a wolf. It wasn't just an animal. It was something else. Something that could walk like us. Something that could think. And it was enjoying this. Go! Chris shouted. We ran, crashing through the trees. Branches whipped against my face, my lungs burning. Mark's flashlight bounced wildly, casting long shadows. Ryan stumbled, blood dripping down his arm. I grabbed him. What happened? He didn't answer. Didn't need to. Because behind us, the thing wasn't chasing. Not yet. It was following. Fast enough to keep us running. Slow enough to let us know it wasn't finished playing. A deep growl echoed through the forest. Not ahead. Not behind. From both sides, there was more than one. Chris cursed. This way, he hissed. Veering left, Mark stumbled after him, flashlight swinging. Ryan's breath came in ragged gasps. The air was too thick, too still. I knew what was happening. It wasn't hunting us. Not yet. It was hurting us, pushing us somewhere. And then, I saw it. A cabin, small, rotting, hidden deep in the trees. The door was open, like someone had left in a hurry, or like something had forced its way inside. Chris didn't hesitate. He bolted toward it, and we followed. The door slammed shut behind us. We collapsed inside, gasping for breath. Mark fumbled with the flashlight, sweeping the room. The place was a wreck, old furniture scattered, claw marks raked across the walls. Something had been here before. Something had left in a hurry, and now it felt like a trap. Ryan slumped against the wall, blood dripping onto the wooden floor. I knelt beside him. His sleeve was torn. 3 long gashes ran down his arm. I pressed my hand against the wound. Ryan, what happened? He shook his head. Something scratched me. His voice was weak. Then, he shivered. Chris locked the door. Mark moved to the window, peeking outside. I don't see it, he whispered. That didn't make me feel better. Something that big shouldn't be able to disappear so easily. But it had. Ryan groaned. Sweat beaded on his forehead. His skin was too pale. His breath too shallow. I pressed a hand against his cheek. Ryan, talk to me. His eyes flickered up to mine. And for a second, just a second, they weren't his. They were yellow, like the thing in the woods. Then they went back to normal. And deep in my gut, I knew. We weren't just being hunted. We had already lost. The night dragged on. The woods outside were silent. Ryan's breathing slowed. Chris kept his knife in his lap. Mark held the flashlight, his hands shaking. I didn't sleep. None of us did. Then a noise. Outside. Footsteps. Slow. Deliberate. Moving in circles around the cabin. Chris gripped his knife. Mark killed the flashlight. The room plunged into darkness. We didn't breathe. Didn't move. Then, something sniffed at the door. Long. Slow. A deep, ragged breath. The doorknob twisted. Ryan whimpered. Chris raised the knife. And then, the scratching started. Long, drawn-out claws against wood. Slow, like it wasn't trying to break in. Like it was just testing the walls. I clenched my teeth. The door wasn't strong. If that thing wanted in, it would get in. And we all knew it. The scratching moved. Up the wall. Across the window. Then, the roof. The wooden beams creaked overhead. Something heavy was up there. Then, silence. We waited, listening. But the sound never came back. And that was worse. Because it meant it was still there. And it was waiting. The first light of morning crept through the cracks. Mark turned the flashlight back on. His hands still trembling. Chris slowly unlocked the door. No one spoke. No one breathed. Then, he pulled it open. And we saw them. The footprints. Circling the cabin. Deep claw marks in the dirt. Ryan stumbled to his feet. His face was pale. Sweat dripped from his forehead. He looked at me. And his eyes, they were yellow again. And this time they didn't change back. Ryan stared at me. His yellow eyes flickered in the dim light. Not like a reflection. Not like a trick of the sun. They were changing. Becoming something else. And my blood ran cold. Because I knew what this meant. Chris and Mark hadn't noticed yet. They were too focused on the footprints outside. On the claw marks raking across the dirt. I grabbed Ryan's arm, pulling him aside. Ryan, listen to me. His skin was cold. His breathing shallow. He blinked. His eyes flickering back to normal. What? I hesitated. Had I imagined it? The yellow. The way his pupils had narrowed into slits. No. I knew what I saw. Something was happening to him. And we were running out of time. Chris's voice cut through my thoughts. We can't stay here. He gestured to the tracks outside. They were circling us all night. Mark exhaled. Yeah. No shit. We need to find the truck. A horrible realization settled in my chest. The truck. It was still back at the campsite. Miles away. Through the woods. Through their territory. Chris ran a hand through his hair. His jaw clenched. We stick together. We move fast. We don't stop. Nobody argued. We just grabbed our bags. And stepped back into the trees. The forest was different now. It felt heavier. Like the trees were watching. Like the path had changed beneath our feet. Ryan stumbled. His breath ragged. I grabbed his arm. Are you okay? He nodded, wiping sweat from his forehead. But his hands were shaking. And I could see it. Something beneath his skin. Like his bones were shifting. Like something was crawling inside him. I swallowed hard. We didn't have long. We moved fast. Too fast. Branches snapped under our boots. The undergrowth whispered around us. Chris led the way. His knife in one hand. His eyes scanning the trees. Mark held the flashlight. Even though the morning sun was already rising. And me, I kept my hand on Ryan's arm. I felt his muscles twitch. Felt his body tighten. Like it was fighting something deep inside. Then, a sound. Somewhere behind us. A branch cracking. Not an animal. Not the wind. Something following. Something stalking. And it was close. Chris froze. His knuckles tightened around the knife. Mark turned off the flashlight. The silence was too loud. Then, a low snarl. Deep in the trees. It rumbled through the forest like thunder. Chris turned. Run. And we did. The woods exploded around us. Branches whipped against my face. Ryan stumbled beside me. His breath coming in ragged gasps. The thing was chasing us now. Not one. More than one. Their howl split the air. echoing through the trees. I glanced back, and my stomach dropped. Dark shapes, moving on all fours, fast, too fast. Their yellow eyes burned in the shadows, and they were closing in. The trees thinned. Up ahead, a clearing. The campsite. The truck. Chris shouted. Move. Mark reached it first, yanking the door handle. Locked. Keys. Who has the keys? Ryan stumbled, his body shaking, his breathing wrong. I grabbed him. Ryan. He looked at me, and his eyes, they weren't human anymore. Mark pounded on the truck door. Chris reached for his pockets, fumbling for the keys. The howls grew closer. Ryan groaned, doubling over. His fingernails dug into the dirt, and then, his spine cracked, right in front of me. I staggered back. Ryan's body convulsed. His arms twisted at unnatural angles. His skin rippled like something was moving underneath it. His breath hitched, then turned into a growl. His jaw elongated. His teeth grew. His fingers curled into claws. And when he lifted his head, his eyes were gold, his mouth dripping with foam. And he wasn't Ryan anymore. Chris got the truck open. Get in. Mark scrambled inside. I hesitated. Ryan, or whatever he was now, lifted his head toward me and snarled. Chris grabbed my shirt, yanking me into the truck. The door slammed shut. Ryan let out a piercing howl, and the woods came alive. The truck roared to life. Chris floored it. The tires spun in the dirt. The howls exploded behind us. I turned toward the window and saw them. Dark shapes, leaping through the trees, running beside us, eyes burning yellow. I clenched my fists. One of them had been Ryan. But the others, they had been here all along, waiting, and now, they were hunting. The truck bounced down the dirt road. Mark screamed. A shape slammed against the side of the truck. The metal buckled. Claws raked against the windows. Chris cursed, yanking the wheel. We swerved. The tires skidded in the mud. Then a shadow landed on the hood. A massive black shape. Fur. Claws. A twisted human-like grin. It slammed its fists against the windshield. Cracks splintered through the glass. Chris shouted. The truck lurched. And then, we hit something. The world spun. Metal screamed. The truck flipped sideways, rolling through the dirt. The windows shattered. Pain ripped through my body. Then, silence. I couldn't move. Could barely breathe. My vision blurred. Through the broken window, I saw the trees swaying, felt the cold air, smelled the blood. Then, a shadow blocked the light. A tall, hulking figure. It crouched beside the wreck, lowered its head toward me, and whispered, "You can't run forever." That was the first thing I felt. A deep aching throb in my ribs, in my arms, in my skull. The second thing I felt was cold. The truck was wrecked. Glass littered the dirt. Smoke curled from the hood. Somewhere behind me, the forest stood silent, watching, waiting. I tried to move, and pain shot through my side. I gritted my teeth, pushing myself up, my breath coming in ragged gasps. Something was wet beneath me. Blood, mine. I didn't know. Then I heard it. The breathing, low, slow, something huge inhaling deeply. I froze. It was close, right outside the wreckage. I turned my head, slow as I could, and I saw it. The thing standing outside the truck, tall, looming, covered in thick matted fur, its shoulders rising and falling with each breath. It wasn't a man. Not fully. Its limbs were too long. Its back hunched, but its eyes, its golden burning eyes, were looking right at me. It leaned forward, sniffing the air. Then, it grinned, and my blood turned to ice. I tried to move, tried to reach for anything. A rock, a weapon, something, but my body wasn't listening. The thing crouched lower, its claws dug into the dirt. Then, a growl. Not from it. From somewhere else. Something deep in the woods. The creature's ears flicked. Then, it stood upright. It turned. And then, it ran. Silence. I sucked in a breath. My hands trembled. The thing had left, but not because it was done. Something else was out there. Something even it didn't want to face. I turned toward the wreckage. Chris lay against the dashboard, blood dripping from his forehead. Mark groaned, shifting beside me. I grabbed his arm. "Mark, wake up." He stirred, his eyes fluttering open. Then he remembered, and the fear came flooding back. Chris stirred, cursed, pressed a hand to his head. Then, the same realization hit him. We were still in the woods, still hunted. And Ryan, he was gone. Mark wiped blood from his mouth. Did we kill it? I shook my head. No. Chris cursed, forcing himself up. Then, we need to move. He gestured toward the trees. That same cold, unsettling forest. It felt closer now. The shadows stretched too long, like the trees had moved in while we were unconscious. I swallowed hard. We were deep in their territory now, and we weren't alone. We grabbed what we could. A half-broken flashlight, a hunting knife, no food, no supplies, just ourselves, and whatever was waiting for us. Chris took the lead. Mark followed. I hesitated. Then, I turned toward the wreck. A feeling crawled up my spine, like I was being watched. I scanned the woods. Nothing, but I knew something was out there, and it was waiting for us to make the next move. We turned and walked into the dark. The forest swallowed us whole. The trees pressed in closer, the air too still. Every step felt wrong, like we were walking deeper into something's trap, like we weren't going anywhere at all. Chris held his knife tight. Mark kept the flashlight low. Nobody spoke. We just kept moving. Then, a sound, a rustling in the trees. Slow, deliberate. Something was following us. Chris gestured for us to stop. We froze. The sound stopped too. Then, a breath, low, deep, right behind us. I turned and saw eyes in the dark. Chris lunged forward. His knife slashed the air and hit nothing. The thing was gone, but not far. The feeling didn't leave. The weight of something watching, waiting. I clenched my fists. We weren't being hunted. Not yet. We were being toyed with. Chris exhaled sharply. Keep moving. And we did. We walked for hours, or maybe it was minutes. Time felt different here, like the forest was swallowing it, swallowing us. Then Mark stopped. Wait. He shined the flashlight ahead. My stomach dropped. The wreckage. The same truck. We had been walking in circles, and that's when we heard it. A voice. "You shouldn't have come back." We spun. Ryan, or what was left of him. He stood at the edge of the clearing, his shirt torn, his skin pale, his golden eyes flickered in the dark, his breath rasped, and his teeth. They were too long now, too sharp. Something had changed. Something had claimed him, and he wasn't Ryan anymore. Chris gripped his knife. Ryan, the thing that used to be Ryan, just smiled. His head tilted, his spine cracked, and then he took a step forward. Chris moved first. He raised his knife, but Ryan was faster, too fast. His clawed hand shot out, and Chris went flying. He slammed into a tree. Breath knocked from his chest. Mark cursed. He swung the flashlight toward Ryan, and in the beam, we saw his shadow stretch, twisting, growing. He wasn't done changing. Chris groaned, pushing himself up. Ryan's mouth curled into a grin. And then, he lunged. Mark shouted. Chris barely dodged, his knife slicing across Ryan's arm. Blood hit the dirt. Ryan staggered back, then laughed, low, dark. And then he whispered, "You don't get it, do you?" His voice wasn't his anymore. It was deeper. "Rover, you're never leaving these woods." I grabbed Mark's arm. "We have to go." Chris didn't argue. We turned, and we ran. The howls followed us, chasing us through the trees. Not just Ryan, the others too. I could feel them all around us. Their eyes in the dark, their breath on my neck. The last thing I saw before we broke the tree line was Ryan, smiling, because he knew this wasn't over. It was just beginning. We ran. Branches whipped against my face. The trees blurred past us, the air thick with the scent of damp earth and blood. The howls followed, too many of them, some close, some far. And Ryan, or whatever he had become, was leading them. Chris was ahead, his knife clutched tight in his fist. Mark was beside me, gasping for air. The forest was too dense, too dark. I had no idea where we were going, if we were even going anywhere at all. Because the deeper we ran, the more the trees started to look the same, like we were running in circles again, like the woods didn't want us to leave. And then, the howl stopped, and that was worse. I staggered to a stop. Chris turned, breathing hard. Mark bent over, hands on his knees. The woods were silent, but I knew we weren't alone. And then, a voice, Ryan's voice, but it wasn't him. It was everywhere. Above us, behind us, inside us. You can't leave. Mark cursed under his breath. Chris clenched his knife. I turned in a slow circle. The trees pressed closer. And then, Tordennis saw them. Shapes in the dark, yellow eyes. Dozens of them, watching, waiting. A pack, surrounding us. Ryan had been one of them. And soon, we would be too. Chris made the first move. He lunged forward, knife slashing through the dark. A figure darted back, too fast to hit. Mark swung the flashlight. The beam caught something moving between the trees. Huge, muscles rippling beneath thick fur. A low growl rumbled through the clearing. Then, a snarl, and they charged. Everything erupted at once. Chris shouted, swinging his blade. Mark swung the flashlight like a weapon. I barely had time to react before something hit me. Hail! I went flying backward, slamming into a tree. Pain shot up my ribs. My vision blurred. I blinked and saw a shadow looming over me. Ryan, or what was left of him. His face was still half human, but his teeth were too long. His fingers had turned to claws, and his eyes burned gold. He crouched low, sniffing the air. Then, he grinned. You were always the weak one. I grabbed a rock and swung. It connected with his jaw. Ryan staggered back, snarling. I scrambled to my feet, heart pounding. Chris and Mark were still fighting. Mark swung a branch, trying to keep them back. Chris's knife was dripping with blood, but the pack wasn't stopping. They were playing, and we were running out of time. Ryan wiped the blood from his mouth. Then he lunged. I dodged, barely. His claws ripped through the air where I had just been. I didn't think. I grabbed a fallen branch and drove it into his chest. Ryan gasped, staggered back. His eyes flickered. For 1 second, just one, he looked like himself again. And then, the snarl returned, and I knew he was too far gone. Chris grabbed my arm. Go, now. You. Mark was already running. Chris shoved me forward, following after him. I didn't look back, didn't see if Ryan was still standing, didn't see if the pack was still chasing. I just ran, and prayed that we would find a way out. The trees thinned, the forest opened up, and then, we saw it. The road, a paved real road. A way out. We sprinted. The howls exploded behind us, but we were already there. We hit the pavement, didn't stop, didn't slow down. We just ran, and ran, and ran, until the forest was nothing but a shadow behind us. A truck stopped, a man inside, an old hunter. He asked no questions, didn't need to. He just looked at our faces, at the blood, at the terror in our eyes, and he let us in. I don't remember how long we drove. I just remember the feeling, that horrible gut-wrenching feeling, like something was still watching us, like something had let us go, not because we had escaped, but because it wanted us to leave, because it knew we would never be the same again. Chris left town, said he was done with the woods. Mark stopped talking to us, said he didn't want to remember, and me, I still have nightmares, of the forest, of the yellow eyes in the dark, and of Ryan, standing just beyond the trees, watching, waiting, because deep down, I know, this isn't over. Not yet, not ever.